My name is Grace White. I am 34. 6 hours ago, I was pulled from the wreckage of a 3-car pileup on the interstate. My lungs burned with every breath, and a jagged shard of metal had left a deep, angry gash across my right forearm. As I drifted in and out of consciousness in a curtained bay at the Baldwin County Hospital, the ER nurse leaned over me, checking my vitals. She smiled with a practiced, gentle sympathy and told me that she had already called my emergency contacts. My parents, Evelyn and Thomas, had been notified 4 hours ago. I waited. I stared at the door, expecting the sharp click of my mother's heels or the heavy, familiar tread of my father's boots. But the door stayed shut. My phone, cracked and flickering, buzzed on the plastic tray beside me. It was a text from my mother. It was the only message I received all day. Heard you had a fender bender. Savannah is hosting her Iron Bowl kickoff party right now, so we really cannot leave Mobile. Call if you need a ride home tomorrow. I read those words 3 times until the letters started to swim and blur. My own mother, the woman who raised me, had weighed my broken ribs against a college football party and decided I was the one who could be safely ignored. Savannah was having a party. I was having the worst night of my life. I did not scream. I did not call back to beg. In that sterile room, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, I felt something inside me snap. It was not a sound, but a definitive, cold separation. For 10 years, I had wired $4,300 into the family joint account on the first of every month. $516,000. I kept the receipts. I kept the spreadsheets. I had been their infrastructure, their secret silent partner, and their primary source of funding. While I lay here with a punctured lung, they were drinking beer and eating white sauce, BBQ on the patio I had paid for. I am not a person who usually acts without thinking, but I reached over with my left hand and dialed my bank's fraud prevention line. I told them I was the victim of unauthorized family coercion and that I needed every single recurring transfer stopped immediately. I am not a victim anymore. I am the one who holds the pen. If someone in your life has ever used your steadiness as a blank check, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me what the most painful realization you ever had about your family was. And be sure to subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories so you do not miss the fallout. The physical shock of the crash was nothing compared to the sharp, suffocating realization of my own expendability as I sat in that hospital bed. I did not experience a calm, cinematic realization that everything was going to be fine. I panicked. The air in the room felt thin and brittle. I sat up too fast, ripping the IV line from the back of my hand, and sobbed into my palms until I could not catch my breath. The sheer unfairness of it tore out of me in ragged gasps that hurt my ribs more than the seatbelt ever could. When the tears finally stopped and the room stopped spinning, a harsh survival instinct kicked in. I am a tax accountant by trade, someone who lives for accuracy and detail. But that night, I was looking at the ledger of my own life and finding it completely unbalanced. For 10 years, I had wired $4,300 on the first of every month to the White family joint account. It started when my father's aging shrimping boat needed expensive repairs that the local marina said would sink the business otherwise. But it never stopped. $516,000. That is the cost of my silence and my devotion. I logged into my banking portal, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice onto the linoleum floor. Each time I picked it up, the screen showed a fresh crack. A spiderweb of damage that felt like a metaphor for my entire history with those people. I tapped Cancel Recurring Transfer, my finger hovering over the screen like it was a detonator. An error message popped up in bold red letters. Account flagged for review. Because I was trying to cancel a decade-old standing order from an unverified hospital IP address. The bank's fraud algorithm had locked my entire portal. They were protecting the money from me, the person who had actually earned every cent of it. because the system assumes the account holder is the one trying to do the stealing. I had to call the 1-800 number, fighting through the thick pain medication haze that clouded my thoughts, to verbally force the cancellation. I sat there for 40 minutes, listening to the tinny, cheerful hold music, explaining to a call center employee in a different time zone that I was currently strapped to a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs and that I was dying to see my own money stop flowing to a group of people who would not drive 20 minutes to see if I was alive. The representative warned me it would take 48 hours to process because of the legacy status of the account. I hung up, exhausted, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor next to me. The money was stopping, but the retaliation was just beginning. My parents lived in a house in Mobile that I had effectively paid for, while I spent my weekends auditing small businesses in small offices. My father, Thomas, was a man who measured his worth by how loud he could be at a dinner table. Yet he hadn't managed to make a single mortgage payment in half a decade. My mother, Evelyn, spent her days curating a reputation for charity and grace that vanished the moment she saw a medical bill. I was their secret subsidy. That night, as I drifted in and out of a medicated sleep, I began to see the patterns I had spent years ignoring. It wasn't just the money. It was the way they referred to my career as a cute little habit, while treating Savannah's social climbing as a full-time professional endeavor. Savannah was the youngest, the one who took dance lessons until her feet bled, the one who never had to learn how to change a tire or file an extension. She was their mirror, reflecting back the lifestyle they pretended to live. I was the one who had to be useful. I was the tool in the shed, only brought out when a light fixture needed changing or a checkbook needed balancing. Every time I had tried to talk about it, they had pivoted to the same tired narrative about how hard it was for them, about how they had sacrificed their own dreams to raise me. But I was the one who worked 3 jobs through college while they sat in their climate-controlled living room and debated the merits of a new deck. The resentment was a living thing in my chest, more painful than the broken ribs. I checked my phone at 4 a.m. Still nothing from mobile. No calls. No texts. No panic. They were sleeping in the house I paid for, in the beds I had bought, probably dreaming about their next social event. It was then that I realized cancellation wasn't going to be enough. If I simply stopped the flow, they would just move on to the next person. Probably Savannah, who would then come begging to me anyway. I had to show them the floor. I had to strip away the illusion that my help was a natural resource, like water or air. My life up to that point had been a series of silent, efficient repairs. I was the person who fixed the leaking roof before the rain started. I was the one who balanced the books before the auditor arrived. But you cannot fix a broken house if the foundation is rotting. You have to burn the house down and start over. I looked at the hospital room door, waiting for someone to come in and offer me a blanket or a different painkiller. Instead, I opened my secondary browser. I pulled up the records for the family's assets, the ones I had access to because of my role as the family bookkeeper. I looked at the mortgage document for the mobile property. My name was on the loan as a guarantor, a decision I had made when I was 22 and terrified of my father's shouting. I had forgotten about that. I had erased it, buried it under layers of responsibility and work. Now, it felt like a trap I had set for myself. If I defaulted, they would come after my credit. If I kept paying, I would remain their permanent servant. I needed a way out that didn't involve them. I opened a new tab and started researching legal options in Alabama for terminating joint liability. The search results were a list of complex, expensive legal hoops. Every single one of them required money, time, and a level of confrontation I was still physically too weak to manage. The door opened again. But this time it was the hospital social worker, a woman named Sarah with soft eyes and a clipboard. She didn't offer a platitude. She just pulled up a chair and asked if I had a plan for when I was discharged. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't have a home to go back to. My condo in Birmingham was 3 hours away. and I was in no condition to drive. My parents' house was off the table. Mawmaw Loretta was my only option, but she lived in a small apartment that wasn't equipped for someone in a rib brace. For the first time in my life, I felt the sheer weight of being completely, utterly alone. I told Sarah that I was working on it, which was a lie. I was working on surviving the next hour. She sensed the tension, the way I was holding my jaw. But she didn't push. She left me with a stack of discharge instructions and a bottle of pain medication that made the room look like it was floating. I fell asleep for 2 hours and had a dream about my mother standing in front of my hospital bed, her face a mask of disappointment because I had dared to crash my car and inconvenience her schedule. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. My phone vibrated. Another notification. A bank alert. My mother had tried to charge the joint credit card for a dinner at the local yacht club. It had been declined. She hadn't even checked the balance. She just expected it to work. She was so used to me being the safety net that she hadn't even considered the possibility that the net had been cut. She hadn't even tried to call me to ask why it was declined. She just assumed it was a technical glitch and went on with her evening. The utter, total lack of consideration was the sharpest blade yet. It wasn't malice, necessarily. Malice is personal. This was something colder. This was indifference. It is far easier to hurt someone when you don't even believe they are a person with their own needs. I knew then that I had to do more than just cancel the transfers. I had to change the fundamental power dynamic of our relationship. I had to become someone they couldn't control because they no longer had a hold over my finances or my emotional state. I sat up in bed, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain in my side, and pulled my laptop toward me. I started to map out every single financial entanglement, every joint account, every secondary credit card, every shared utility bill. It was a massive, intricate web. A spider's nest of obligation I had spun for myself over 10 years. I decided right then that I would not leave a single thread connected. If it had my name on it, it was coming off. If it had their name on it, I was washing my hands of it. I was going to be the auditor who finally closed the books on the White family. I looked at the photograph of the hospital ceiling and decided that from this moment on, I was the only person who mattered in my calculations. My life had been a long, expensive series of transactions, and I was finally declaring bankruptcy. I was going to be a new person, one who didn't calculate the cost of love before giving it. I felt a weird, twisted kind of relief as I worked, a lightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the painkillers. The storm was coming, but I was the one who was going to set the direction. I was ready to leave the wreckage behind. 3 hours later, the heavy door to my room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. I expected a nurse or perhaps a doctor coming to check on my stabilizing blood pressure. Instead, the figure framed in the doorway was stoic and familiar. It wasn't my parents. It was my grandmother, Mawmaw Loretta, my father's mother. At 78, she was a woman who moved through the world with the force of a tectonic plate. She still drove her own vintage Buick across the Mobile Bay Causeway whenever the mood struck her, dodging the heavy morning traffic with a terrifying, absolute confidence. She did not offer a dramatic hug or fake tears. She did not try to brush my hair back or whisper comfort. She walked to the foot of my bed, carrying a faded, well-worn leather satchel that smelled like old paper and peppermint, and pulled up a chair. She looked at the tubes, the monitors, and the bruised skin on my arms with the detached appraisal of a rancher checking a fence. "They aren't coming, Grace," she said, her voice gravelly and direct, cutting through the sterile silence of the room. "Evelyn is too busy showing off that new patio furniture you paid for." She did not elaborate on how she knew where they were. She did not need to. Loretta had her own network of neighborhood eyes. A local grapevine that spanned from the coast of the Gulf of Mexico up to the Appalachian foothills. She reached down, unzipped her satchel, and pulled out a thick, bound document. It was a copy of my late grandfather's revocable living trust from 2012. I had heard whispers of this document when I was a child, legends of a grandfather who cared about his lineage. But I had never seen the pages. "You need to see this before they bleed you completely dry," she told me, placing the weight of the paper onto my lap. The trust clearly designated me as the primary beneficiary of a $2 million estate upon my 30th birthday. I was 34 years old. I had never seen a dime of it. I stared at the text on the page, the words blurring as my mind scrambled to process the implications. Evelyn was the named trustee, the gatekeeper of a fortune that was supposed to have secured my independence years ago. According to the meticulous, handwritten ledgers Loretta had quietly obtained through her connections, my mother had been siphoning the yields for years. It was all there in black and white ink. Savannah's pageant gowns, those ridiculous, overpriced designer dresses she wore for regional titles she never actually won, Mardi Gras society fees for local organizations that barely registered as charity, and down payments on lifestyle accessories I had never even heard of. The betrayal wasn't just neglect. It was grand larceny hidden behind a thin veil of motherly love. I felt my grip tighten on the document, the rough edges of the paper digging into my palm. "Why now?" "Mawmaw," I whispered, my voice sounding small in the vast, quiet hospital room. She looked at me, her eyes unblinking, the pale blue of the bay at dawn. "Because you finally broke, Grace. You are good at holding things up, but you are not a miracle worker. A wall that carries too much weight eventually crumbles." I had spent my entire life believing that my parents' financial struggles were my personal failure, that if I just worked a little harder, earned a little more, or sacrificed a little deeper, the house of cards would stop wobbling. I was an accountant, someone who prides herself on clear, logical outcomes. Yet I had been living in a delusion of my own making. My grandmother tapped a finger on the ledger page. "Look at the withdrawals. Look at who signed the checks." It was Evelyn. Always Evelyn. I leaned back, the rib brace pressing into my chest, and tried to understand the scale of what had happened. Every month, I sent money to keep their house afloat, thinking I was helping them survive, while my mother used that money to fund Savannah's vapid social life and used the trust funds to live a life of comfort. It was a perfectly executed scam. They were not struggling. They were just prioritizing their own performance over my existence. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent calculating taxes for clients, sweating over the smallest discrepancies in their revenue streams, while my own family was siphoning my life away behind my back. It felt like being stabbed in the back by a scalpel I had handed them myself. The anger was rising now, replacing the shock and the sorrow. It was a sharp, hot thing, a feeling of being used that went all the way to my bones. "Do they know you have this?" I asked, my voice finally steady. Loretta scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound that was entirely characteristic of her. "Evelyn thinks she burned the originals years ago. She thinks I am just an old woman who talks too much. She has always underestimated me because she only values people who have something she wants to buy." I realized then that my grandmother had been playing a much longer game than I had. She had been observing, documenting, and waiting for the right moment to release the truth. She was not the fragile old woman my mother treated as an afterthought. She was the architect of my survival. Loretta pointed to the final page of the trust document. "There is a clause in here. If the trustee is found to be in breach of fiduciary duty, the remainder of the estate passes to the contingent beneficiary immediately." "That is you." I looked at her, stunned. She was telling me that we didn't just have evidence. We had the legal power to pull the plug on their entire lifestyle right now. But what about the bank? What about the injunction? I asked, remembering the trouble I had already encountered with the bank's fraud department. "The bank is afraid of litigation," Loretta said dismissively. "They follow the paper. Give them this paper." and they will run for the hills." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the room like a command. "You have been the good daughter. You have been the useful daughter. Now, it is time to be the one who gets their inheritance back. Do not be polite. Do not ask for their understanding. You take what is yours." I looked at the document again. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about reclaiming my name, my reputation, and my agency. My parents had treated me like an ATM with a pulse, assuming I would always be there to pick up the tab for their failures and their delusions of grandeur. They had relied on the fact that I was too confident, too hardworking, and too emotionally invested in the idea of a family to ever look under the hood of their financial affairs. They had spent years building an image on the back of my labor, and now that the foundation was exposed, it was time to tear it down. The thought of confronting my mother, of walking into that house in Spring Hill with these documents in my hand, filled me with a strange, dark electricity. I was the one who had worked the graveyard shifts in college. I was the one who had skipped vacations to pay for their property taxes. I was the one who had earned the right to this money. I asked Loretta why she hadn't come to me earlier with this. Her expression didn't change, but she reached out and briefly touched my bandaged hand. "I couldn't protect you from them until you were ready to stand on your own. Grace, if I had brought this to you when you were still trying to be the perfect daughter, you would have just handed it over to your mother to keep the peace. I needed you to be broken enough to stop fixing their problems and start looking at the rod." She was right. I would have tried to negotiate, to appease, to fix the trust and give them a chance to explain. The hospital bed, the broken ribs, and the text message about the football party had been the necessary fire to forge a different path. I wasn't the same woman who had entered the ER on Friday night. That woman was dead. I was someone new, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to recover. I asked Loretta if she had a lawyer in mind, and she pulled a small card from her pocket. Mr. Vance, the most ruthless probate attorney in southern Alabama. She had already set the stage. All I had to do was step into the role. The room seemed to grow quiet, the hum of the hospital infrastructure fading into the background of my own thoughts. I looked at my grandmother, really looked at her, and saw the steel that ran through her veins. I had spent my life wishing I could be more like Savannah, soft and coddled and adored, never realizing that I had something much more valuable, a legacy of resilience that my mother had tried to stifle. I was a white, yes, but I was also a granddaughter of a woman who didn't take any nonsense. I felt a surge of gratitude that I had never felt for my mother. I reached out and took my grandmother's hand, the skin like parchment, the grip tight as a knot. "We are going to do this properly, aren't we?" I asked. Loretta nodded, a small, grim satisfaction touching her lips. "We are going to do this in a way that leaves no room for their excuses." I spent the next hour reviewing every line of the trust document, every ledger entry of the siphoned funds, and every discrepancy that had been conveniently ignored by my mother's management. It was a map of betrayal, every mile marker accounted for in dollars and cents. I wasn't just angry, I was analytical, my mind snapping into the precise, efficient mode I used when correcting complex tax filings. I was going to turn their own game against them. They expected a daughter who would cry and beg for a seat at the table. They were about to find out that I was the one who held the deed to the entire house. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the hospital room, I looked at the folder on my lap and felt the first true peace I had known since the crash. It was going to be a long, ugly, and necessary fight. But I was ready. I wasn't just reclaiming my inheritance, I was reclaiming my life. One entry at a time. The real work was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the relentless heat of the Alabama summer pressing against the hospital windows. I discharged myself before the doctors made their rounds, because staying in that room meant waiting for a rescue that I now knew would never come. I moved gingerly, my rib brace serving as a rigid reminder of the night my life had splintered on the asphalt of the interstate. My movements were calculated. Every shift of my shoulders, a sharp reminder of the cost of my family's indifference. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, refusing to look at the other patients in the hallway, refusing to look for the faces I had spent a lifetime hoping to see. I had survived the crash, and now I had to survive the cleanup. I navigated to my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The drive to the regional bank branch in downtown Mobile was a blur of Spanish moss draped over oak trees and the humid, heavy air that feels like a wet wool blanket against your skin. I drove slowly, my body aching with every bump in the road. I parked in a spot near the entrance of the branch office. I was there to perform a simple task. Severe the joint accounts I had shared with my parents for years. My intention was to leave no trail, no ambiguity, no tether that could be tugged at by my mother's manipulative fingers. I walked into the lobby, the air conditioning hitting my skin with a welcome, biting chill. The bank branch manager, a man I had known by name for years, sat at his desk. I sat across from him, feeling the sharp, stiff lines of the rib brace beneath my dress shirt, expecting a quick signature and a sense of relief. Instead, he did not reach for the usual forms. He pulled a thick, official-looking file from beneath his keyboard. His face, usually a mask of professional neutrality, was drawn and tight. He handed me a legal notice that bore the stamp of a local law firm. Evelyn had somehow been alerted to my attempts to modify the account over the weekend. She had preemptively filed a formal dispute with the bank, invoking an obscure rent and care verbal agreement clause. I stared at the paper, reading the words twice. The legal firm was the same one my mother used for the local garden club's charity registrations. The notice claimed that my monthly transfers of $4,300 were not gifts, as I had believed for a decade, but rather contractually obligated payments for Savannah's ongoing college debts and medical costs, which Evelyn had co-signed as my legal representative until I turned 35. It was a lie built on a foundation of technicalities. Because Evelyn was a primary signer on the joint account, the bank had taken the path of least resistance. They froze the disputed $18,000 remaining in the account while their legal department began an internal review. Mr. Henderson, the manager, looked at me with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and professional obligation. We have to conduct a 45-day internal investigation into the nature of the funds. Ms. White, he explained, his voice low and apologetic. I was locked out of my own emergency savings, the money I had set aside for the very medical bills I was currently accruing from the car accident. I walked out of the branch and stepped into the suffocating mobile humidity. The air felt thick enough to chew. I stood in the parking lot, the asphalt shimmering under the high noon sun, and realized my mother was not just greedy. She was tactically vicious. She had weaponized the banking system against me to starve me into submission. She knew exactly how the system worked, how to invoke a freeze, how to trigger an investigation, and how to create a logistical nightmare for someone who didn't have the time to fight it. She wasn't just stealing, she was actively trying to ruin my professional stability by forcing me to chase money I had already earned. I had to survive the next month and a half on my corporate tax firm salary alone. I had no savings now, no safety net, and a mountain of medical copays arriving in my mailbox every day. As a corporate tax accountant, I spend my life reading the fine print of ledger entries and statutory regulations. I know the power of a signature and the weight of a liability clause. I have advised dozens of clients on how to structure their assets to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation. Yet I had never once applied that same standard of scrutiny to my own family. It is a specific kind of humiliation to realize you have been the expert auditor for everyone else, while your own house was being systematically looted. I stood by my car, the metal door burning against my hand, and let the reality of the situation settle into my mind. I was a person who specialized in untangling knots of debt and equity, and now I was the knot, I realized that for all my professional competence, I had been an amateur in my personal life, playing by a set of rules that my mother didn't even recognize. I drove toward the local pharmacy to pick up my prescriptions, my mind working like a machine. I had no money for a long legal battle, and the bank was going to keep my funds tied up until their deadline. I had to pivot, and I had to do it fast. I thought about the bills sitting on my desk at home, the ones I had been putting off because I was busy with work. Every single one of them suddenly seemed like a looming threat. The rent, the car insurance, the internet, the utilities, they were all tied to a bank account I could no longer reliably use. I needed to open a new, completely isolated account. A step I should have taken years ago but had avoided out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. The betrayal wasn't just the theft of the $18,000. It was the realization that my mother had been monitoring my banking habits closely enough to intercept my attempt to leave, meaning she had been watching me far more closely than I had been watching her. My phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting another call from the bank or perhaps an email from my firm regarding my leave of absence. Instead, it was an automated alert from the hospital billing department. My stomach dropped. The alert stated that the primary insurance carrier had denied coverage for the emergency room visit and the diagnostic imaging from the accident. The reason provided was a discrepancy in policy coverage. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my breath hitching in my throat as I tapped the link to review the claim. The policy had been modified. The coverage for emergency trauma care had been downgraded to a catastrophic-only plan 3 days before the crash. My mother, who had been on the family umbrella policy, had made the change. I remembered her asking for my password for the insurance portal months ago to fix a recurring issue with the prescription renewal. I had given it to her because I trusted the person who had raised me. The denial notice was accompanied by a message stating that the account was now in arrears because the deductible had jumped from $200 to $5,000. I wasn't just facing the loss of my savings, I was facing an immediate, out-of-pocket medical bill that exceeded my monthly salary. It wasn't an accident. She hadn't just changed the plan, she had timed the change to the weeks surrounding my accident. I stared at the phone, the world around me fading into a dull roar. This was the second trap. The one that wasn't about the money in the savings account, but about crippling my credit rating before I could even find my feet. If the hospital bill went to collections, it would shatter my financial profile, making it impossible to secure the credit I needed to fix the mess she had created. She was squeezing the life out of my financial standing, ensuring that I would have to come back, hat in hand, begging for her help to survive. I put the phone in the passenger seat and started the engine. I could feel the cold, sharp focus returning to my mind. The same focus I used during a difficult tax audit when the numbers didn't align. I wasn't going to call her. I wasn't going to send another desperate text. I had to call the insurance company and prove that the policy change was made without my authorization, which was a process that would require notarized affidavits and multiple days of documentation. I also needed to reach out to the hospital billing office and explain the situation, though experience told me they wouldn't care until the investigation was resolved. I was fighting a war on 3 fronts: the bank, the insurance provider, and the hospital billing department. I realized then that I had been playing a game of checkers while my mother was playing high-stakes chess. She had been 3 steps ahead, moving pieces into place to ensure that when I finally tried to walk away, I would have no ground left to stand on. But she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated the very person she was trying to destroy. She assumed that a tax accountant, when backed into a corner, would simply fold because of the social pressure of family. She didn't realize that I knew how to read the system better than she did. I knew that every audit has a paper trail, and every fraudulent change has a timestamp. I began to construct a mental list of everyone I needed to contact, everyone who had been involved in the administration of my policies, everyone who could verify that I had not requested those changes. The weight of the situation was immense, but for the first time, I felt a strange kind of liberation. There was no more ambiguity. The mask had slipped. And I was looking at the reality of my parents' devotion without any filters. They were not my protectors. They were the architects of my ruin. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon. I still had time to visit the insurance agency in person before they closed. I wasn't going to be a victim of a phone call or a web portal. I was going to be an active participant in my own defense. I turned the car and headed toward the regional headquarters of the insurance firm. I felt the physical pain of my ribs, the dull throb of the bruise on my arm. But I didn't care. I was fueled by the cold. Precise anger of someone who has finally seen the truth and is ready to rewrite the ledger. As I drove, I thought about the house in Spring Hill, the one where my mother was currently sitting, probably discussing the latest rumors with her social circle. She had no idea that I was already moving toward the exit, already collecting the evidence that would eventually turn the tables. She thought she was winning, that the squeeze was working, that I would be calling her in a panic before the week was out. Let her believe it. Let her enjoy the comfort of her misplaced confidence. I was building a case that didn't depend on her goodwill, but on the unassailable truth of legal fact. I wasn't playing her game anymore. I was changing the rules. I reached the building and parked, taking a deep breath before stepping out. I smoothed my clothes, adjusted the rib brace, and walked toward the glass doors. My head held high. I was ready to talk to the manager. I was ready to demand the truth. I was ready to start the audit. And for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. The drive to Spring Hill took me through neighborhoods where the houses were spaced far apart and the lawns were manicured with surgical precision. It felt like a different world from the downtown branch where I had spent the morning pleading my case. The oaks here were older, the fences whiter, and the sense of security felt like a physical weight. My parents lived in a colonial house with a wraparound porch that I had refinanced twice, just to keep them in the style they felt they deserved. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I could still smell the remnants of the charcoal smoke from the party Savannah had hosted the weekend of my accident. It hung in the heavy, humid Alabama air, a stubborn, lingering reminder of exactly where their priorities lay. I did not bother to park the car properly. I left it angled near the front steps, grabbed the folder containing the bank notice and the insurance claim, and marched up the walk. My rib brace felt like a corset of iron, digging into my skin with every step. But the pain only sharpened my resolve. I did not knock. I never knocked at the house I had spent half my life subsidizing. I pushed the front door open, the sound echoing through the foyer. The house was quiet, the air conditioned to a shivering temperature that contrasted sharply with the summer heat outside. I followed the sound of a knife hitting a cutting board and walked straight into the kitchen. Evelyn was standing at the granite island, meticulously arranging a bouquet of white hydrangeas she had picked from the garden. She looked elegant, composed, the picture of a woman who had never once worried about an unpaid utility bill. When she heard me, she turned, a faint look of irritation crossing her face that vanished when she saw the state of me. My shirt was stained. My hair was a mess from the stress of the morning, and the rigid outline of my rib brace was visible under my clothing. She didn't look worried. She looked annoyed that I had broken the aesthetic of her kitchen. I didn't give her the chance to speak. I threw the bank notice, the one detailing the frozen funds and the rent agreement, lie directly onto the granite island. The paper skidded across the surface, coming to rest near her hand. Evelyn didn't yell. She didn't throw it back. She simply stopped moving. Her hand, still holding a stalk of hydrangea, went limp. She looked at the paper, then back up at me, and I saw the first genuine crack in her armor. Her face crumpled, not in a way that looked like a performance, but in a way that looked like old walls caving in. She sank into a kitchen stool, the tears spilling over instantly, tracks cutting through her foundation. You do not understand what it is like to have nothing. Grace, she choked out, her voice raspy and raw. It wasn't the usual haughty tone she reserved for our Sunday dinners. It was the voice of a scared person. She began to talk, and for the first time in my life, she didn't stop to ask if I was listening. She told me about the Appalachian foothills, about a winter in the 70s when the power company had cut their heat in January because her father couldn't pay the bill. She talked about the feeling of breath turning into mist in the bedroom, the constant, low-level terror of wondering if there would be food on the table, the desperate need to look like they had made it. She spoke about Savannah being fragile, about how my sister had been born with a heart condition that made her seem like a permanent patient in the eyes of the family. She claimed that Savannah could not survive the real world, that she would be shredded by the cruelties of life if she didn't have a cushion. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, and said, "You are strong. Grace, you can work. You were always the one who could handle the fallout." For a fleeting second, my heart ached. I saw the scared little girl she used to be, the one who grew up terrified of freezing in the dark, and I felt the weight of her trauma. It was a terrifying, suffocating fear that had been passed down like a genetic defect, coloring every financial decision she ever made. She wasn't just hoarding money, she was trying to build a fortress against a childhood that never really left her. But as I watched her, the ache transformed into a cold. Hard clarity. Trauma is an explanation for why someone becomes the way they are, but it is not an excuse for financial abuse. My mother's fear was not a reason to steal my future. It was just a motive. She had chosen to keep her own daughter in the dark, to lie to her own child, to forge signatures and create webs of debt, all to appease a ghost from her past. I looked at her, realizing that I had been paying for her therapy for 20 years. And the bill was finally coming due. "Your fear does not give you the right to steal my future." "Mom," I said, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping my composure. I didn't wait for her to apologize. I didn't wait for her to tell me she loved me. I had heard enough. I turned around and walked out of that kitchen. The air behind me filled with the sound of her jagged, desperate sobbing. I reached the front door and took a breath that felt like breathing in shards of glass. But I kept moving. I reached the car, my hand still steady. I pulled out my phone to update Mr. Vance on the confrontation. But before I could open the app, a text message popped up on the screen. It was from Savannah. I had forgotten she even had my number after I blocked her on social media, but she had apparently found a way around it. The text was short. "Mom just called me crying. You really are going to destroy this family over money, aren't you?" It was the final, perfect punctuation mark to the morning. My sister didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the crash. And she certainly didn't care about the forgery. She only cared that the stream of easy money was being threatened. I stared at the screen, feeling the coldness in my veins turn to ice. My mother had already called her. The narrative was being spun. The victim card was being played. And the family was already rallying to protect the only thing they cared about their status. I looked at the house one last time. It was a beautiful place, well-kept, prestigious, and completely hollow. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were looking at a structure I had once helped maintain, only to realize that the wood was rotten through. I didn't know what Savannah would do next, but I knew she would go to the ends of the earth to keep her lifestyle, and she would drag me down with her if she could. I drove away from Spring Hill, my mind working like a high-speed calculator, moving from one task to the next. I had to contact the bank and provide them with the documentation I had collected from Loretta, the trust documents, and the evidence of the forgery. I needed to move fast before Savannah and Tucker could concoct their own version of events. I reached for my phone, but before I could call the bank, another text arrived. This one wasn't from Savannah. It was from an unknown number. It contained only a single address, the office of a bankruptcy attorney in Mobile that I had never heard of before. I stopped the car on the side of the road, the hum of the highway traffic creating a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. Why would someone send me the contact information for a bankruptcy attorney? I typed the name into my search engine and found that this specific lawyer specialized in involuntary filings. My mother was planning a legal maneuver, one designed to tie up all the White family assets in a protracted court battle to prevent me from taking control. She wasn't just playing defense. She was initiating an offensive strike to hold the funds hostage. She was trying to declare a state of financial emergency to invoke a temporary stay on any asset distribution. It was a desperate, scorched earth tactic. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just a family argument. This was professional sabotage. I had to get ahead of this filing. If I could get to Mr. Vance before the end of the day, we could file an emergency petition to block any involuntary bankruptcy proceedings. I checked the time. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The law firm in downtown Mobile would still be open for another hour. I turned the car around, ignoring the pain in my ribs, and headed back toward the city. The traffic was starting to thicken as the afternoon commute began. But I didn't care. I felt as if I were finally playing the game according to my own rules. My mother wanted to fight with legal maneuvers, with bankruptcy filings, with scorched earth tactics. Fine. I would meet her there, and I would bring every single piece of documentation I had. I wasn't the naive daughter anymore. I was the person who understood the ledger. As I drove, I thought about the house in Spring Hill. They had acted like they were the ones who would lose everything. But I knew the truth. They had lost their connection to reality long before the bank freeze. I entered the downtown area, the skyscrapers casting long, cool shadows across the street. I was mentally preparing for the conversation with Mr. Vance, deciding how to explain the new threat. The city looked different to me now, less like a collection of business opportunities and more like a board on which I was making the final moves. I reached the building and parked, my hands feeling firmer on the steering wheel than they had in months. I walked into the lobby, passing the security desk with a nod, and hit the button for the 14th floor. The elevator ride felt like a transition between 2 different lives. I was no longer the tax accountant who fixed the books at home. I was the one who was finally exposing them. When I reached the law firm, Mr. Vance was in a meeting. But his assistant recognized the look in my eyes and motioned me toward his office immediately. I told him about the bankruptcy attorney, and he didn't look surprised. He just opened his laptop and started typing. He knew exactly what she was trying to do. It was a classic move for someone trying to preserve a failing status quo. We spent the next 30 minutes outlining our strategy to block the filing. He was thorough, demanding every detail I could provide. For the first time, I felt like someone was on my side. Not because I was useful, but because I was right. We finished the paperwork just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple. I walked out of the office feeling like I had just completed the most important tax audit of my life. My phone buzzed in my bag, and I didn't even have to look to know who it was. I ignored it, walking out into the cooling evening air. I was still in pain. My ribs and arm were screaming for rest. But the mental clarity was worth every second of it. I had survived the confrontation. I had identified the next threat. And I was moving forward. The final realization hit me as I reached my car. I hadn't just stood up to them. I had effectively ended their ability to manipulate me. The house, the money, the status, it was all secondary to the fact that I had chosen to stop being the one who absorbs the fallout. I sat in my car for a moment, listening to the city sounds, the distant blare of a horn, the hum of traffic, the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. It was the sound of a life that was finally mine, unencumbered by the expectations of people who never cared enough to ask if I was okay. I drove home, taking the long way around the bay. The water was dark and still, reflecting the lights of the city like a mirror. I was tired, deeper than I had ever been in my life. But I was not defeated. I knew what I had to do next. And I knew I had the resources to do it. The war had escalated, but I had the high ground now. And for the first time, I knew I was going to win. I was ready for whatever they threw at me next. Because I had spent 34 years preparing for this moment. The books were balanced. The truth was out. And I wasn't going to let them win by default ever again. I pulled into my driveway, the house sitting dark and silent in the night. It felt good to be home, even if the silence was just the beginning. I knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, more legal maneuvers, more attempts to manipulate me. But I was no longer the person who would sit in a hospital room and wait for them to arrive. I was the one who was going to dictate the terms. The next morning would be the start of a new, different life, and I was looking forward to every second of it. The silence in my condo after the bank had flagged the account was not peaceful. It felt heavy. A static charge in the air that suggested something was about to break. I spent that Monday morning reviewing my physical file of transactions again, trying to find a loophole, a hidden clause, or an error in the bank's processing. I was operating on a rhythm dictated by necessity, counting every cent and rationing my energy to conserve what was left of my strength. By Tuesday, I had managed to secure a temporary transfer of my remaining personal cash into a separate, untraceable account at a different credit union. Just enough to cover my basic living expenses for the month. It was a humiliating process, standing in line at a credit union with my rib brace visible, explaining that I was essentially starting my financial life over at 34. I was focused, precise, and detached, channeling all my energy into the mechanics of my own survival. I did not want to think about my parents or Savannah. I wanted to focus on the numbers. Wednesday was when the world decided to test my resolve. I had just come back from a light grocery run, my side aching from the effort of carrying the bag, when I heard the raised voices echoing through the marble-tiled lobby of my building. It was an unmistakable sound, sharp and demanding. The kind of tone that usually accompanies a complaint about a restaurant bill or a perceived slight from a service worker. I stepped out of the elevator and stopped cold, standing by the reception desk, glaring at the terrified security guard. Was Savannah. She looked as polished as ever, dressed in a designer sundress that cost more than my weekly food budget, her hair blown out to perfection despite the humidity. Beside her stood Tucker, a local real estate developer who had been a staple of the local country club scene for years. He wore a pastel polo shirt that seemed to glow in the lobby light, and a scent of cologne that I could smell from 10 feet away. Savannah saw me before I could retreat into the elevator. She marched across the lobby, her heels clicking against the stone floor like small gunshots. I did not ask her how she got into the building, and I did not ask her about my ribs, which were currently protesting the weight of the groceries. I simply braced myself, grounding my feet and refusing to let her see the tremor in my hands. She didn't offer a greeting. She stopped directly in front of me, her eyes flashing with a combination of entitlement and genuine panic. Her credit cards had been declined at 3 different boutiques on Dauphin Street, and she was clearly experiencing the withdrawal symptoms of a life sustained by someone else's bank account. I didn't care about the fashion. I cared about the sheer audacity of her presence. She wasn't here to apologize for the hospital abandonment. She was here because her wallet had stopped working. I looked at Tucker. He looked at me with a smirk that was meant to be intimidating, but only succeeded in being remarkably thin-skinned. He didn't say hello either. He reached into the leather briefcase he carried and pulled out a thick document. It was a legal summons. He didn't hand it to me. He practically shoved it into my chest. I had to drop the grocery bag to catch it. The sound of a carton of eggs cracking on the tile floor ringing out in the quiet lobby. The security guard retreated behind his desk, clearly deciding that this was not part of his job description. Tucker explained, with the smug confidence of a man who owned the local courts, that he had retained a prominent local attorney to file a temporary injunction against me. The charge was breach of verbal contract. He claimed that I had explicitly promised to cover the $60,000 down payment for a house in Gulf Shores that he and Savannah had their eyes on. He argued that his firm had already allocated funds for the project based on my promise, and that my sudden refusal to provide the money had caused irreparable damage to his professional reputation. I read the document right there in the lobby, the ink still fresh on the paper. The allegation was entirely fabricated. A desperate, clumsy attempt to force a settlement. But legal strategy in Alabama doesn't always rely on the truth. It relies on the ability to freeze assets and drag out proceedings until the opposition runs out of steam or capital. Tucker had moved quickly. He had filed in a county jurisdiction where he had existing ties, and the temporary injunction had been granted before I was even notified. By the time I finished reading the summons, my phone buzzed in my bag with a push notification from my bank. The account I had moved my emergency cash into only 2 days earlier was already frozen. The injunction had been broad, covering not just the disputed amount, but every cent I had in my name. They hadn't just sued me, they had cut off the oxygen to my entire life. Tucker stood there, his arms crossed, waiting for me to break. He expected me to cry, to beg, to admit that I had made some vague, drunken promise to pay for his house. He wanted a reaction. Savannah watched me, her expression a mix of fury and expectation. She was waiting for me to fix it, to find some way to make the numbers work, to make the bad situation disappear. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. I looked at the broken eggs on the floor, then back at them. The logic of their plan was painfully clear. By freezing my assets through a fabricated claim, they were ensuring that I couldn't afford the legal fees required to fight them. It was a classic scorched earth tactic. They were leveraging the cost of the legal system to force me into a corner where settling for a lesser amount would seem like the only rational choice. I had spent my career auditing companies for exactly this kind of behavior, using legal threats to suppress competition or extract value. It was an old, ugly story, and seeing it played out in my own building by my own sister made it feel even more grotesque. I didn't speak. I looked at the guard, who was still hovering by the desk, and asked him to call the police to escort them off the premises. The look on Savannah's face shifted from panic to genuine, snarling rage. She couldn't believe I wouldn't engage. She couldn't believe I wasn't going to try to argue my way out of it or offer a compromise. I just stood there, my hand resting on the broken bag of groceries, and waited. When they realized I wasn't going to provide a scene for their amusement, they turned around, shouting threats about court appearances and attorney fees that would ruin me by the end of the year. I watched them leave, the glass door swinging shut behind them, sealing the lobby back into its cold, professional silence. I knelt down and began to pick up the broken shards of the carton. My ribs ached, a constant, dull throb that worsened with every movement. My personal finances were now in a state of suspended animation. My legal fees were already ballooning, and I had a preliminary hearing scheduled in 3 weeks to defend myself against a lie. It was a bleak situation, the kind that would have sent a less resilient person into a downward spiral of hopelessness. But as I wiped the floor, I noticed something. The summons didn't just mention the Gulf Shores property. It contained a list of assets that Tucker's firm claimed I was liable for assets I didn't even own. They had been sloppy. In their rush to freeze my accounts, they had included properties and trusts in their filing that were clearly and demonstrably held by other entities. They had cast too wide a net, assuming I wouldn't have the resources to properly review the document. The mistake was an opening. If they were willing to lie on a sworn affidavit regarding the assets I was liable for, it meant their entire claim of a verbal contract was likely built on the same shaky ground. I finished cleaning the floor and went back up to my condo. The silence in the elevator felt different now. It didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like preparation. I spent the evening doing what I do best, documenting the fraud. I pulled every calendar entry, every text message from the last year, and cross-referenced them with the dates Tucker claimed the verbal contract was made. It was a clear, impossible timeline. On the date he claimed I committed to the down payment, I had been in an audit meeting with a client 3 hours away, supported by sign-in logs and security footage. I had a rock-solid alibi for the exact moment of the supposed promise. I printed the documents and placed them in a new folder. I didn't have a lawyer yet. Not a good one. But I had the evidence. The initial feeling of being cornered began to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. They wanted a fight. I would give them a fight that would exhaust their resources and force them to account for every single word they had uttered in their suit. I wasn't just defending myself, I was preparing a countersuit for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. I was going to turn their legal weapon into a hammer that would shatter their own credibility. I sat at my desk and pulled up the records of Tucker's development firm, looking for any other inconsistencies I could leverage. It didn't take long. They had filed for tax extensions multiple times in the last 3 years. A red flag in a high-growth environment. I could see the potential for a larger investigation if I dug deeper. But that was a task for another time. I was still focused on the immediate conflict. I knew that in 3 weeks, I would be standing in a courtroom, staring at my sister and her fiancé across a table. I knew they would be prepared to lie, prepared to perform, and prepared to play the victim. I needed to ensure that the judge saw the reality of the situation. Not a breach of contract, but a systematic attempt to extort a person who had spent her entire life paying for others' mistakes. I called my office and requested a temporary leave extension. I didn't explain the details. I just stated that I was dealing with a private legal matter and would be out of commission. My boss, a man who valued results over social chatter, didn't ask questions. He told me to take the time I needed and to make sure everything was organized when I returned. I spent the next several days living on nothing but caffeine and the sheer driving need to be prepared. My life had been reduced to a single objective. Every morning, I woke up with the intent of gathering more proof. I went through old emails, archived chats, and even looked at the metadata on my own photographs to build a chronological map of my movements. I was building a barricade of facts against the wave of fabrications they were sending my way. The pressure was relentless. I had bills coming in that I couldn't pay, threats of collections on medical debts I shouldn't have had, and a looming court date that felt like a guillotine. But every time I felt the panic rising, I looked at the folder. It was a tangible piece of my future, proof that I was not just a tool to be used, but a person with a life and a career and a sense of self-worth that couldn't be bought. I took a walk through the local park on Sunday evening, watching the sunset over the water, trying to force myself to breathe and find a moment of peace. The park was crowded with families and couples, the kind of scene that would have depressed me before. But now it just seemed like a chaotic collection of lives. I wasn't envious anymore. I didn't want their ease. I wanted my own truth. I heard someone call my name, and I turned to see Mawmaw Loretta's neighbor, a woman who often walked her dog past my condo. She stopped to ask how I was doing, her voice filled with that polite, surface-level concern people use when they have heard rumors but want the details straight from the source. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I told her I was working on a project, something big, and that I was very busy. She nodded, clearly disappointed, and moved on. That was the power of the wall. Once you stop being the one who carries everyone else's gossip and manages everyone else's reputation, you become a mystery. And people don't like mysteries when they are used to knowing exactly where you stand and how they can use you. I returned home and checked my email, finding a notification from the court system. They had moved up the hearing date. It was now happening in 10 days. My heart didn't race, it skipped a beat, but only in rhythm with the plan. 10 days was enough time to finish the document review. 10 days was enough to put the final polish on my response. They had moved it up, probably thinking I wouldn't be ready. They thought I would be scrambling, unorganized, and desperate. They had no idea I had been training for this kind of pressure my entire life. I made a cup of coffee and went to the desk, laying out the files in a way that made sense to my accountant's brain. I felt a surge of strength that I had never felt before, a feeling of finally being the one in control. The struggle wasn't just against Savannah and Tucker. It was against the 15 years of silence and the obligation I had internalized. Every file I reviewed, every lie I uncovered, felt like a brick I was pulling out of a wall that had been built to imprison me. I was taking the structure apart, piece by piece. And I was going to show them exactly what happened when you tried to stand on a foundation that had decided to move. The case against me was a mirage, a fragile, temporary thing that would vanish the moment I applied the right amount of pressure. I thought about my parents, currently sitting in their beautiful home in Spring Hill, waiting for the results of the lawsuit. They were probably assuming everything would go their way, that the daughter they had treated like a disposable asset would just roll over. They didn't know that I was no longer interested in their approval or their acceptance. I was interested in justice. The cold, hard, accounting kind. I looked at the brass pen in my pocket. It was still there, a reminder that I had someone who believed in me. Someone who hadn't needed to buy my affection. I knew what I had to do. I would keep digging. I would keep documenting. And I would make sure that when we finally stepped into that courtroom, I was the only one in the room who had the complete picture. The next 10 days would be a blur of motion and concentration. But I was prepared. The storm was here, and I was finally ready to face it without an umbrella. I locked my condo door and stood there in the entryway as the deadbolt clicked into place, the sound echoing like a final gavel strike against the hardwood. The injunction papers in my hand felt heavier than lead, their edges biting into my palm. I looked down at the balance on my phone. $412 in a secondary checking account. That was it. My ribs screamed in agony as I exhaled, the rib brace constricting my chest and reminding me of the night I had nearly died on the asphalt of I-10. My medical bills were piling up on the kitchen counter like a stack of incoming artillery fire. And my own sister was dragging me into court on a web of fabricated claims. I did not have a clever plan. I did not feel like a mastermind. I felt like a woman who had been hollowed out from the inside. I walked into the kitchen, the space I had kept immaculate for years, and the silence of the room started to gnaw at me. I threw my purse onto the island, and the weight of the injunction papers seemed to pull the air out of the room. The exhaustion, which had been lurking at the edges of my perception since the hospital, crashed into me all at once. I sat on the floor, the cold tile pressing against my skin, and the dam finally gave way. I did not weep like the women in the movies who have someone to catch them. I sobbed with a raw, ugly sound that tore at my throat, my hands pulling at my hair until my scalp stung. I cried for the mother who preferred to drink sweet tea on a patio rather than visit her daughter in the trauma unit. I cried for the sister who had looked at me and seen only a credit card number. I cried for the sheer, exhausting weight of being the capable one for my entire adult life, the person who made sure the bills were paid. The family events were scheduled, and the disasters were averted. I was 34. And I was sitting on a kitchen floor in Alabama, shattered because I had finally understood that my family did not love me. They merely tolerated me as long as I was useful. My hand brushed against a ceramic coffee mug I had left on the floor. It was a simple, sturdy thing, decorated with a faded logo from a professional accounting association. Without thinking, I gripped it, my knuckles turning white, and hurled it toward the stainless steel refrigerator. It hit the metal door with a sickening, hollow clang and disintegrated, porcelain shards spraying across the tiles like shrapnel. I didn't stop there. I screamed until the air in my lungs was gone, a sound that carried all the bitterness, all the unspent rage of 15 years of being the secret tax auditor for a family that looked down on my career. I wasn't just losing money, I was losing the delusion that I was part of something bigger than myself. I sat there in the middle of the debris for what felt like hours. A messy, broken woman surrounded by the ruins of my own kitchen. I wanted someone to call. I wanted a mother who would worry, a father who would be outraged on my behalf, a sister who would care that I was hurt. But the phone in my purse remained silent, except for a taunting buzz from a notification I ignored. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, leaving only a dull, pulsing throb in my side and a profound, bone-deep stillness. I stood up, my legs trembling, and went to the utility closet for the broom. The act of cleaning became a slow, deliberate ritual. I swept every fragment of the shattered mug into the dustpan, the bristles making a rhythmic scratching sound on the floor. With each sweep, I felt the sharp edges of my grief being gathered, contained, and discarded. By the time I emptied the pan into the trash, the paralyzing sorrow had solidified into something else, a cold, absolute focus. The grief hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a weight that dragged me down. It was fuel. I knew then that I wasn't going to settle. I wasn't going to let them run me out of my own life. I was going to dismantle their illusion, piece by piece. And I was going to do it with the precision of a professional who knew exactly where the cracks in the foundation were located. I walked to the kitchen island, cleared away the debris, and placed my laptop on the granite. I opened the file for Tideline Property Restoration. This was not just a business. It was the mechanism of my independence. I began to organize the documentation I had collected. I needed to see exactly how much leverage I actually had. As I worked, my phone began to buzz again. It wasn't my mother, and it wasn't Savannah. It was the human resources director from my firm. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked up. The call was short and pointed. There had been an inquiry from a law firm in Mobile regarding my employment status, citing a pending legal action. My firm had a policy about civil suits involving employees, and the HR director wanted to know if the injunction posed a threat to my professional reputation. My hands gripped the edge of the desk until they went numb. The conflict I thought was isolated to my family had just migrated into the one place I thought was safe. My professional life, the one I had built far away from the shadow of the white name, was now being tainted by their interference. The firm was concerned about the publicity, about the optics of a tax accountant embroiled in a breach of contract scandal. They weren't asking for my side of the story, they were asking for a liability assessment. I told the director that the injunction was entirely fabricated and would be dismissed. But I could hear the hesitation in their voice. A scandal, even a false one, is a headache that corporate firms try to avoid. I had to convince them that I was a liability to the opposition, not to the company. I explained that I had retained counsel and was preparing a countersuit for malicious prosecution. The director stayed silent for a long moment, finally saying that they would hold off on any immediate action until the preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. But my status would be under review. I hung up, my mouth dry. The threat was real. If I lost my job, I would lose the ability to fund my legal defense, and the entire structure I was trying to save would collapse. I realized that Savannah and Tucker weren't just aiming for a house down payment, they were aiming for my career. They were trying to take away my ability to fight back. I stood up and paced the small space of my kitchen, the rib brace feeling tighter than ever. I couldn't afford to be just a victim in this scenario. I had to be a predator. I needed to know why Tucker was so desperate for this money, why his firm was willing to engage in such a blatant legal lie. I did some digging, not through the court documents this time, but through business registers. I found a public record of a partnership between Tucker's development group and a local construction supplier that had recently faced a series of missed payments. The supplier was the same one my parents used for their home renovation project. It was all connected. Tucker was not just a developer. He was part of a larger, failing ecosystem of local projects that were currently hemorrhaging cash. If his firm was failing, he needed the $60,000 not for a down payment on a house, but to keep his own business from being exposed by the supplier. I had found the leverage. I sat back in my chair, looking at the screen as the pieces began to click into place. I wasn't just fighting a greedy sister and a desperate fiancé. I was fighting an entire network of failed investments and broken promises. They needed me to settle because I was the only reliable source of liquidity they had left. The realization was almost exhilarating. I wasn't just a tax accountant looking at someone else's messy financials anymore. I was looking at the insolvency of my own family. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 7 in the evening. I had been working for hours, the adrenaline keeping the pain of my ribs at bay. I had a path forward, a plan that involved attacking the vulnerability in Tucker's business rather than just defending against his lawsuit. I needed to find a way to present this to the judge at the preliminary hearing. I needed to show that the injunction was a desperate act by a man who was already insolvent and using the court to resolve his own liquidity crisis. I made another cup of coffee, the smell of the roasted beans filling the room, and settled in to map out the connections. I traced the money from the supplier to the development firm, and from the firm to the injunction. Every transaction was a line in a ledger, and I was going to force them to balance it in court. My mother called again while I was working. I saw her name on the screen, a ghost from a life I was systematically erasing. I didn't answer. I didn't let the voicemail record. I just watched it ring, the light on my phone glowing in the darkened kitchen. She had no idea what was happening. She still thought this was about a petty family squabble. About Savannah's vanity and the need for a house. About the power dynamics of a family that had always been controlled by her whim. She had no idea that I had stopped being the girl who would sit in a garage to keep the peace. I had become the person who understood the ledger better than anyone else in the room. I was the person who was going to take the account apart. I decided to call Mawmaw Loretta, not to ask for advice, but to tell her I had a path forward. When she answered, her voice was warm, a stark contrast to the cold business calls of the day. I told her what happened with the HR director and what I had discovered about Tucker's business. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered a laugh, a sharp, genuine sound that echoed in my kitchen. You were always the one who knew how to find the mistake in the column. Grace, you are doing exactly what you were meant to do. She didn't tell me to be careful. She didn't tell me to seek peace. She told me to make sure the evidence was airtight. I felt a wave of relief. Knowing I had at least one person who understood the necessity of the fight, I worked through the night. The silence of the condo finally feeling like a refuge rather than a prison. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. The injury was still there. The financial pressure was still intense. And the court date was still looming. But the panic had vanished. I was in my element. I was an accountant looking at a fraudulent return, and I was going to find every discrepancy, every misrepresentation, every lie. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known in years. I wasn't fighting for their love or their approval anymore. I was fighting for the truth. And the truth, I had learned the hard way, was the only thing that could actually set me free. The window in my kitchen showed the first hints of dawn. A soft gray light that promised a new day, one where I wouldn't have to apologize for being who I was. I packed my laptop and the folder, ready to head back to Mr. Vance's office first thing in the morning. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my ribs, but I ignored it. I had work to do. I walked to the door, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind. I felt like I was stepping out into a world where I finally had a say. I walked out into the cool morning air, the sound of the city waking up around me. I had a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks, and a lot of work to complete before then, but I was ready. I turned the lock, took a deep breath, and walked toward my car. The breakdown had served its purpose. It had burned away the illusions. And now, I was ready to build something that was actually mine. The struggle was far from over, but the advantage had shifted. I was the one with the books now, and I was the one who was going to close them. My mother, my sister, and her desperate fiancé thought they were orchestrating a show, but they had no idea who was actually holding the ledger. As I started the engine, I felt a strange, quiet excitement. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was about to expose the entire family structure as the fraud it had always been. I pulled out of the parking garage, the city skyline looming before me. A vast, complex set of problems that I was finally, absolutely qualified to solve. I had the facts. I had the documents. And I had the focus. Let them have their day in court. I was ready to settle the debt. I took a full week of medical leave from my corporate tax firm, citing a severe recovery process from the car accident. But I spent every waking hour in a war room of my own design. I cleared the dining room table, pushing aside the half-empty medicine bottles and the stray mail, and laid out Granddad's revocable living trust documents alongside 7 years of my own federal and state tax returns. I am an accountant, and numbers are my native language. They are the only things in my world that possess an objective, unvarnished truth. I traced the trust stipulations line by line, my finger moving across the paper with the slow, deliberate pace of an auditor hunting for an imbalance. I was legally entitled to assume control of the estate principal the moment I turned 30. I was 34 now. That was 4 years of lost autonomy. 4 years of being treated like a bank rather than a person. Tucked into the very back of Mawmaw Loretta's satchel was a supplemental addendum dated exactly 4 years ago. It served to defer my inheritance until age 40, effectively keeping Evelyn as the managing trustee for an additional decade. I stared at the signature at the bottom, my heart hammering against the rigid plastic of my rib brace. It read Grace White. It was a remarkably skilled forgery, mimicking the slope and pressure of my handwriting with chilling accuracy. But it wasn't mine. I knew the muscle memory of my own hand, the way I flicked my pen at the end of a stroke, the specific rhythm of my cursive, the W looped incorrectly, an amateurish tell that Evelyn had missed in her desperate haste to secure control. This wasn't just a petty family dispute anymore. This was felony document forgery and a massive breach of fiduciary duty. I sat back, the air in the room suddenly feeling very cold. My own mother had not just stolen my money, she had criminalized my future. I knew that in the real world, you cannot simply wave a piece of paper at a judge, shout about justice, and expect the police to storm into a Spring Hill mansion to make an arrest. The legal system is a glacially slow machine that requires proof, not just suspicion. I had to prove it legally, systematically, and undeniably. The anger that had been simmering in my chest since the hospital now hardened into a cold, calculated strategy. I didn't reach for a phone to scream at her. I reached for my printer. I began compiling every signed tax document I had from the year in question, using them to build a baseline profile for a professional handwriting expert. I cross-referenced dates, postmarks, and notary stamps, creating a massive, interconnected map of the deception. I felt like a detective working a cold case. Except the victim was myself, and the culprit was currently sitting in a kitchen I had paid for, likely bragging about her daughter's upcoming wedding. I knew I needed more than just the forgery. I needed a trail of intent. I spent the afternoon scanning my emails from 4 years ago, hunting for any mention of the trust or any request from my mother regarding my signature. I found a string of emails where she had aggressively pushed me to sign a batch of routine health insurance updates on an iPad during a particularly chaotic family Thanksgiving. It was a digital trap. She had likely presented the forged trust document as part of a bundle, banking on my exhaustion and desire for family peace to sign without looking. She had calculated exactly how much pressure I could handle before my eyes glazed over. That realization made my stomach churn, but it also confirmed my hypothesis. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a premeditated, long-term financial siege. The next day, I contacted a forensic document examiner. The consultation fee cost me nearly half of what I had left in my secondary account, but it was an investment in my own survival. The expert was a quiet, meticulous man who looked at the trust document for 30 minutes through a magnifying lamp. When he finally looked up, his expression was entirely professional. He confirmed that the signature was a trace forgery, likely done using a light board or a digital overlay, and pointed out the micro-hesitations in the ink flow where Evelyn had tried to correct the loop of the W. He agreed to testify if it came to court, provided we could produce a court-ordered subpoena for the original document. I left his office feeling like I had finally secured a weapon in an arms race I didn't know I was participating in. But the obstacle of the subpoena was still there. I couldn't just walk into a bank or a probate court and demand the original trust without a strong legal reason. I went back to Mr. Tisser, Vance's office, with the examiner's preliminary report. He studied the document, his face unreadable. "This is strong, Grace. But the defense will argue that it was a consensual amendment made during a family meeting," he said, his voice flat. "We have to show that the trust yields were never used for your benefit, which the trust explicitly mandates." I realized then that I needed to document the financial abuse as thoroughly as the forgery. I spent the next 2 days digging through the records I had access to, finding the wire transfers that went directly to Savannah's pageant handlers and the real estate developers Tucker worked with. The patterns were undeniable. A complex spiderweb of transactions that funneled my money away from my future and into the vapid excesses of my sister's life. Every withdrawal was a betrayal, and I cataloged them with a surgical, unemotional efficiency. My home office became a sanctuary of evidence. I had color-coded charts taped to the walls, timelines sketched out on legal pads, and boxes full of receipts that I had kept over the years. Never knowing why, every time the phone rang, I didn't answer. I didn't want to hear my mother's voice, didn't want to hear my father's empty excuses, and certainly didn't want to deal with the latest drama involving Savannah's wedding. I was in a state of hyper-focus, a tunnel vision where nothing existed except the case. I lived on cold coffee and protein bars, my sleeping schedule entirely destroyed, but I didn't feel tired. I felt sharp. I felt like a blade that had been sharpened on the stone of their deception. I was finally becoming the person I had always had the potential to be, a woman who saw the truth and was willing to do whatever was necessary to preserve it. The strain of the situation, however, began to show in ways I hadn't anticipated. My landlord sent me a notice that my lease wouldn't be renewed because I had been missing my local property tax correspondence, not because I hadn't paid, but because my mother had been redirecting my mail for months. She was trying to make my life as inconvenient as possible, hoping to force a return to the status quo. I spent an entire day dealing with the Postal Service, filing a formal complaint about unauthorized mail redirection. It felt like playing a game of whack-a-mole with a person who had infinite resources and zero moral boundaries. I had to change my address for everything, secure a post office box, and ensure that no other family-linked entity could touch my communications. The logistical load was exhausting, an added layer of administrative warfare that I had to win before I could even get to the legal battle. By the end of the week, I was emotionally frayed. I had successfully managed the evidence, but the isolation was starting to take its toll. I didn't have anyone to share the victory with, no one to tell me that I was doing the right thing. I was a professional at hiding my emotions, and I had become a master at hiding my life. I called Loretta on Friday evening, hoping to hear that familiar, gravelly voice. She picked up, sounding frazzled. Apparently, Evelyn had stopped by Loretta's apartment, demanding to know if I had been speaking to her. My grandmother had sent her packing with a few choice words about the state of her conscience, but the stress had clearly taken a toll on her. I felt a pang of guilt. I was bringing the fire into my grandmother's quiet life. "Don't you worry about me, Grace," Loretta insisted, her voice gaining strength. "I have dealt with Evelyn's nonsense for 30 years. She isn't going to break me, and she isn't going to break you." I hung up, feeling a bit better, but the pressure was still there, mounting with every passing day. I had an upcoming meeting with the bank's legal team regarding the injunction, and I knew they would be looking for any reason to keep the freeze in place. I needed to present them with a clear, concise package of evidence that made the verbal agreement look like the blatant fraud it was. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the timeline, ensuring that every claim I made was supported by at least 2 pieces of documentation. I was preparing a narrative that was so bulletproof that even the most skeptical bank lawyer wouldn't be able to ignore it. I realized that my life had become a series of strategic maneuvers, a chess match where the board was my own family's history. As I sat there, the light from my desk lamp reflecting off the computer screen, I received an alert from an unexpected source. It was an email from the local developer Tucker was associated with. He had inadvertently CC'd me on a thread about the Gulf Shores property project. The email mentioned a Grace White guarantee that was still being listed as an active asset in their project proposal, despite the fact that I had never signed any such thing. They were still actively using my identity to secure their financing. I stared at the email, my mouth agape. This wasn't just a legal battle over a down payment. This was institutional fraud. Tucker was using my name to leverage credit, a move that could lead to federal charges if exposed. The stakes had just jumped from a family dispute to a potential criminal enterprise. I knew exactly what I had to do next, and it didn't involve the bank manager in Mobile. I needed to document this email chain as the ultimate piece of evidence for the inevitable litigation. The trap was closing on them, not because I had planned it this way, but because they were too arrogant to stop digging their own graves. The next morning, I took the email to Mr. R. Vance. He looked at the document, his eyes widening. Grace, this changes everything. If he's using your name for fraudulent loans, this isn't just about a down payment. This is wire fraud. I realized the payoff was no longer about winning the case. It was about making sure that every single person involved in this extortion, Savannah, Tucker, and my mother paid a price that would leave them permanently sidelined. The emotional weight of the last few weeks began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, calculating sense of purpose. I had been playing their game, but now I had found the hidden engine room, and I knew how to shut it down. I left the office with the clear understanding that the next few weeks would be the defining time of my life. I would stay calm, I would stay focused, and I would make sure every single player in this drama accounted for their part. The end of their influence over me was within reach, and I was going to see it through to the final. Necessary conclusion. The air in Mr. Vance's office was stagnant, smelling of old leather and the persistent, metallic tang of the coastal humidity that seemed to seep into every building in downtown Mobile. I sat across from him with exactly $400 to my name, the last of the small emergency fund I had managed to pull out before the bank lock. He was a seasoned probate attorney, a man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from Alabama limestone. He studied the trust addendum I had brought with me, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the lines of the forged addendum. When he finally looked up, he let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to deflate the entire room. Grace, this is not television, he said, his tone clinical and detached. I cannot walk into a courtroom tomorrow and have your mother arrested for this. It is a harsh reality that people do not realize until they are sitting in this chair. He didn't offer a platitude. He laid out a grueling, realistic timeline that made my head swim. We had to hire an independent forensic document examiner to officially verify the forgery. Because of the massive backlog of cases in the state, that alone would take at least 6 months. We also had to issue a series of subpoenas to the bank, demanding Evelyn's specific transfer logs that linked the trust account to Savannah's various personal accounts. This was not a quick win. It was an endurance test. The retainer fee he quoted for a case of this complexity was massive, far beyond my current liquidity. I had to negotiate a payment plan, committing a significant portion of my future corporate salary for the next 2 years just to get the door open. I walked out of that office feeling like I had just mortgaged my own freedom to pay for a battle I hadn't even begun to fight. My life became a ledger of severe austerity. I stopped buying anything that wasn't essential. I rationed my groceries until my pantry was just bags of rice and boxes of pasta. I wore my oldest work clothes blazers that were slightly frayed at the cuffs and trousers that had lost their sharp crease to save every possible cent for legal fees. I had to continue showing up at the logistics firm every single day, hiding the rigid, uncomfortable structure of my rib brace under oversized, dark blazers. I mastered the art of the professional smile, keeping my face perfectly composed during client meetings, while my personal life was an active war zone. Every time a client spoke to me about supply chain efficiency or quarterly logistics, I was thinking about the handwriting expert and the bank subpoenas. It was a dual existence, living in a world of numbers by day and a world of legal sabotage by night. There were no quick fixes. There were no dramatic overnight victories where the villain was carried out in cuffs. It was a slow, exhausting grind of filing motions, updating budget spreadsheets, and waiting for the justice system to slowly turn its rusted, heavy wheels. I felt the physical toll of the car accident lingering in the background, a dull ache that accompanied every legal document I drafted and every email I sent to Mr. Vance. The stress was a constant companion, sharpening my senses but slowly eroding my reserves. I was fighting my own blood with the weapons of the law, and the cost was everything I had, but I kept showing up. I kept working. I kept filing. Because the alternative was a lifetime of being their infrastructure, their secret silent partner who existed only to absorb their failures. One evening, while reviewing a stack of utility bills, I found another anomaly. It wasn't about the trust. It was about the insurance premiums for the family house. My mother had been overpaying the premiums on a policy that didn't cover what she claimed it did. I realized she had been skimming off the top of the insurance payments, using the overage to pay for her country club dues. The sheer, relentless nature of the greed was breathtaking. It was never just one thing. It was a constant, low-level siphoning of every available dollar. I added this to the file for Mr. Vance. Every cent had to be accounted for. Every lie had to be documented. And every dollar had to be traced back to its origin. I was becoming an expert in their greed. And I was starting to see the architecture of their entire life as a house built on sand. The isolation was the hardest part to bear. My coworkers saw a dedicated professional who was perhaps a little quieter than usual. A woman who rarely took lunch breaks and always seemed to be working on a personal project after hours. They didn't see the internal struggle. The way I had to steady my hands before opening a letter from my father's attorney, or the way I had to breathe through the anger when I saw my mother's name on a bank statement. I couldn't explain it to them. And even if I could, they wouldn't have understood. In the corporate world, you solve problems. You don't litigate your own parents for felony forgery. I learned to keep my personal life in a box, locked away, just like the craft folder I carried to and from the law firm. Then, a new conflict emerged. One I hadn't seen coming. My sister, Savannah, had apparently been talking about my unreasonable behavior at the local charity events my mother frequented. It wasn't long before my firm received a call from one of their major donors, a board member of the logistics firm who also happened to sit on the same hospital foundation board as my mother. The donor asked, in a roundabout way, whether my personal legal situation would reflect poorly on the company's reputation. I had to sit through a meeting with my manager, explaining that I was the victim of financial abuse, not the instigator of a scandal. I didn't get into the nitty-gritty of the forgery. I just stuck to the fact that I was the victim of a legal vendetta. It was a terrifying moment. The realization that they weren't just fighting me in court, they were fighting me in my career. The one place where I had achieved genuine success. My manager was cautious, but he was also a man who valued my performance above all else. He told me to keep my personal matters out of the office, a fair request that made my skin crawl with the effort of containment. I realized that Savannah was using her social capital as a weapon, trying to make me a pariah in every circle I inhabited. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance, I was fighting for my standing as a professional. I had to produce results that were so undeniably excellent that the firm couldn't justify letting me go. Regardless of what kind of stories were being whispered at charity galas in Mobile, I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. I stayed later. I volunteered for the most difficult audits, and I made sure every single deliverable was perfect. I was building a barricade of competence that they couldn't breach. However, the legal costs were outpacing my earnings. I started looking for ways to cut corners. Buying generic groceries, walking to the office to save on gas, and putting off essential car repairs until the truck literally couldn't move. My financial life was a tightrope, and the wind was blowing from every direction. I was drowning in medical copays. My savings account had been gutted, and the legal retainer was a hole I was constantly trying to fill. It was a brutal cycle of work, pay, and worry. I felt the physical strain on my body, my ribs still occasionally flared with sharp, stabbing pains when I moved the wrong way, and the mental load of keeping track of every single document, every court deadline, and every legal bill was enough to drive anyone to the edge. It was during one of these low moments, sitting on my floor and trying to calculate the next month's payment plan, that I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, fearing another demand from the family or another threat from a lawyer. But the impulse to be ready, to be the person who manages the situation, was stronger than the urge to hide. I picked up. It was a man, his voice low and unfamiliar. He didn't introduce himself, but he mentioned the address of my family's old summer place. He said that my mother had been there last week, meeting with a contractor. My heart skipped a beat. Why was she visiting a property she didn't own? I listened as he told me about a plan to renovate the place before selling it. My mother was trying to liquidate the summer home, the one place that still felt like a connection to my grandfather, despite the fact that the title was tied up in the trust she was supposed to be managing. The audacity was staggering. She wasn't just stealing the yields. She was preparing to sell the core assets. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. This wasn't a family dispute about an inheritance anymore. This was a systematic effort to strip the estate bare before the court could intervene. She was moving with the urgency of a person who knew the clock was ticking, and I was the only one who could stop her. I called Mr. Vance at home, ignoring the hour. He was surprisingly calm. "We'll file for an emergency stay on any asset transfers," he said. His voice clipped and efficient. "But we need more evidence. Grace, we need to catch her in the middle of a sale." I felt a surge of cold. Calculated purpose. I had been reacting to their moves for weeks, but now I had a chance to lead. I started researching the contractor who was working on the summer place. It was a small, local firm that usually did repairs on rental properties. I had a hunch that my mother hadn't told them the house was under dispute. I managed to get the contractor's contact info from a public database and placed a call. I didn't tell them who I was. I posed as an interested buyer checking the property's status. The contractor was surprisingly chatty, telling me that the owner had promised to have the house clear for sale by the end of the month. I had the confirmation. She was actively moving to sell an asset that was part of the disputed trust. I forwarded the information to Mr. Vance immediately. This was the opening we needed. We could file for a permanent injunction, not just on the assets, but on her status as a trustee. The evidence was shifting from suspected mismanagement to active, verifiable fraud. The feeling of being cornered began to lift, replaced by the grim satisfaction of a trap finally beginning to spring. I hadn't realized that the very greed that drove my mother would be the instrument of her undoing. She couldn't help herself. She wanted the money, and she wanted it now. And that impatience was leading her right into the hands of the very people who were building the case against her. I looked at the folder on my desk, the one that had started this entire journey, and felt the weight of it. It wasn't just a collection of documents anymore. It was a roadmap to justice. I wasn't the daughter they had discarded. I was the person they should have been afraid of from the start. As I packed my bag for the next day, I noticed a small, Handwritten note tucked in the side of the folder I had received from Loretta. It was my grandfather's handwriting, something I hadn't noticed before. Tucked in a fold of the trust document, it read, "For Grace, because you are the one who knows the value of a house." I held the note, the ink faint and yellowed, and realized he had known. He had known she would try to take it, and he had made sure I was the one who could stop her. The realization was a quiet, steadying force in my mind. I was not alone in this fight. Not really. I had the truth. I had the evidence. And I had the resolve of the one person who had actually cared about my future. I locked my desk, the lock turning with a final, decisive click. Tomorrow, I would meet with Mr. Vance and finalize the move for the emergency injunction. Tomorrow, the game would shift from defense to offense. Tomorrow, I would start taking back everything they had stolen. I looked out the window one last time, watching the lights of the city flicker. I was ready. I was done with the exhaustion. Done with the panic. Done with being the sacrificial lamb. I was the accountant now, the one who held the pen. And it was time for the final tally. The weight of the world felt lighter, because for the first time, I wasn't just carrying it. I was in control of it. I closed the office and walked to my car, the air crisp with the coming autumn. I knew the court hearing would be brutal, that the family would do everything in their power to destroy me before the judge could see the evidence. But I also knew something they didn't. I had the signature that mattered. I had the document that was legally bulletproof. And I had a witness in my grandmother who wasn't afraid of the truth. I drove home in the silence, listening to the city hum, feeling a strange, new sensation and absence of fear. I was prepared for the lies, prepared for the tears, and prepared for the final, cold reckoning. The house was finally settling, and I was the one who was going to walk through the front door. And as I turned the key to my apartment, I saw a light flickering on my porch. A neighbor had left a package for me. I picked it up, expecting another bill, but it was a small, heavy box. I didn't open it right away, deciding instead to let it sit, an unknown variable in an equation I was currently solving. But as I set it down, a faint, familiar sound of jingling keys came from inside, and I knew exactly who had sent it. It was a twist I hadn't calculated, one that shifted the entire dynamic of the battle. The small box left on my porch contained a set of tarnished brass keys and a note from Mawmaw Loretta detailing which locks they belonged to at my grandfather's old coastal properties. It was a silent reassurance that the physical assets were secured. But the real battlefield was already moving from legal documents to the court of public opinion. While I was meticulously building my case with Mr. Vance, my mother launched her own offensive. It was February, the height of Mardi Gras season in Mobile. Long before New Orleans threw a parade, Mobile established the oldest carnival celebration in the United States. It is a season governed by elite mystic societies, formal masquerade balls, and deeply entrenched social hierarchies where neighborhood gossip dictates local standing. In this town, reputation is currency. And Evelyn knew exactly how to spend it. My mother possessed a terrifying talent for weaponizing sympathy. She attended her weekly society luncheons and church committee meetings wrapped in the aura of a devastated matriarch. She did not tell her friends that her daughter was suing her for felony document forgery. Instead, she crafted a narrative that was far more insidious. She told everyone who would listen that I had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury during the car accident on Interstate 10. It was a brilliant, ruthless lie. By framing my actions as the erratic, paranoid delusions of a brain-damaged child, she cast herself as the tragic, long-suffering caregiver. Any mention of lawyers or frozen bank accounts was quickly dismissed as my unfortunate cognitive decline. She told the prominent families of Spring Hill that I was trying to bankrupt my own parents due to a medical psychosis. The rumor mill in a southern town operates with lethal efficiency. It does not confront you directly, it simply starves you of oxygen. The first casualty was my professional side income. To supplement my corporate salary and accelerate my student loan payoffs, I maintained a small roster of independent freelance tax clients. Many of them were local business owners who attended the same sprawling Baptist church as my parents. On a Tuesday morning, the owner of a heritage bakery I had advised for 4 years called to terminate our contract. He sounded deeply uncomfortable, clearing his throat multiple times before citing vague concerns about my personal stability and ongoing health issues. 2 days later, a regional hardware supplier sent a brief email ending our retainer for the exact same reason. The implication was clear. They believed the whispers that I was mentally unfit to handle their ledgers. My mother was deliberately poisoning the well of my livelihood, aiming to cut off the secondary income I desperately needed to pay my mounting legal fees. The professional damage was severe, but the social isolation was suffocating. Mobile is a city built on generational ties and Southern hospitality, a culture that enforces a strict adherence to respecting your elders above all else. Defying your parents, regardless of their sins, is viewed as an unforgivable breach of the social contract. I felt this reality most acutely on a Thursday evening at the grocery store on Airport Boulevard. I was wearing my bulky rib brace under a loose sweater, navigating the aisles to pick up the cheap staples that now constituted my diet. As I turned into the produce section, I spotted 2 women who had been fixtures in my life since high school. They were the mothers of my former classmates, women who used to host me for sleepovers and offer me slices of warm pecan pie. When they saw me, they did not wave or offer a polite Southern greeting. They stiffened, averted their faces, and pushed their shopping carts briskly down a different aisle to avoid speaking to me. I stood there holding a bag of apples, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and felt a profound, biting chill. They did not need to scream at me to make their point. The ostracization was a quiet, suffocating blanket thrown over my entire existence. My family was leveraging the deep-seated cultural norms of our region to punish me for daring to hold them accountable. They wanted to make it so unendurable for me in my own hometown that I would drop the lawsuits, release the bank freeze, and fall back in line just to regain my community. They wanted to break my spirit before I could ever reach a courtroom. I left the grocery store with my few items, the humid evening air offering no relief from the stifling pressure. Driving back to my condo, the physical pain in my chest was a constant throb, a sharp reminder of the wreck that had initiated this entire ordeal. But the emotional toll was far heavier. I was a corporate tax accountant who thrived on logic, rules, and balanced ledgers. I was equipped to fight a legal battle against a forged trust document. I was not prepared to fight an invisible war against the pitying glances of bank tellers, the sudden unresponsiveness of old friends, and the polite but firm rejection of long-standing clients. Evelyn was trying to turn me into a ghost in the city I called home. I sat at my kitchen island that night, surrounded by the towering stacks of financial records, subpoenas, and court filings that now defined my life. The quiet of the apartment was heavy. I reviewed my budget, calculating how many months I could sustain the legal retainer with my reduced income. The numbers were grim. The loss of the freelance clients had blown a significant hole in my monthly projections. My mother's strategy was working. She was squeezing my resources, hoping the financial drought would force a surrender. I stared at the paperwork until the text blurred. The temptation to stop fighting was a seductive whisper. If I dropped the civil suit, if I let the forgery slide, the rumors would magically clear up. The society matrons would welcome me back. The clients would return, and the crippling pressure would evaporate. I could go back to being the useful, quiet infrastructure of the White family. I could go back to paying for Savannah's lifestyle and ignoring the theft of my grandfather's legacy. It would be so easy to just surrender and let the lie become the truth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tarnished brass keys Loretta had left on my porch. I traced the jagged edges of the metal, My grandfather had known the value of the estate he built, and he had trusted me to safeguard it. He had known Evelyn's nature long before I did. I thought about the scared, desperate woman my mother had revealed herself to be in her kitchen. A woman willing to destroy her own daughter's reputation to protect her unearned comfort. Surrendering to that kind of cowardice was not an option. I would not let a fabricated brain injury be my legacy in this town. I refused to let the social pressure dictate my survival. I picked up my pen and began revising my budget, cutting deeper into my own comfort to ensure Mr. Vance received his next payment. I drafted an email to my corporate manager, requesting to take on extra, complex auditing projects that carried overtime bonuses. I would work 90 hours a week if it meant funding this fight. I was going to push through the isolation. Let the Spring Hill elite whisper into their sweet tea. Let the local business owners pull their contracts. I was building a barricade of undeniable, documented facts. And gossip cannot hold up under cross-examination. I decided I would walk with my head high, rib brace and all, and force them to look at the woman they were trying to erase. The days dragged into weeks, each one a test of endurance. I kept my head down at the corporate firm, delivering flawless tax strategies while carrying the weight of my ruined reputation in silence. I ignored the stares in the coffee shop and the unanswered text messages from former acquaintances. I focused entirely on the forensic document examiner's timeline and the impending bank subpoenas. My world shrank to the size of a legal pad. But within those margins, I was in total control. The smear campaign was a brutal, exhausting tactic. But it was also a sign of my mother's escalating desperation. She was running out of moves. I thought I had prepared for every angle of their offensive. I had braced myself for Savannah's tantrums, Evelyn's lies, and the crushing weight of public shame. I had fortified my defenses against every external threat they could muster. I was ready for a drawn-out siege, but I had failed to account for the weakest link in their alliance. Late on a Thursday evening, the steady rhythm of my isolation was broken by a sharp, urgent knocking at my front door. I checked the security monitor, expecting to see a process server or perhaps another irate vendor sent by my sister. Instead, the camera revealed a figure standing under the harsh amber glow of the corridor light, looking over his shoulder as if he were being followed. It was my father. Thomas White was a man who preferred to avoid conflict by sinking into the background, letting his wife steer the ship while he quietly enjoyed the spoils. Seeing him standing outside my condo, miles away from the protective bubble of Spring Hill, was a shock that momentarily paralyzed me. He wore a faded windbreaker, and his shoulders were hunched, carrying the posture of a man who had finally realized the gravity of his own complicity. I stood frozen in my living room, the glowing screen of the security monitor casting a pale light across my face. He knocked again. The sound hesitant, lacking the demanding rhythm Savannah or Evelyn would have used. My father had never once visited my apartment in the 5 years I had lived here. His sudden appearance, cloaked in the shadows of the evening, signaled a fracture in the united front my parents had so carefully constructed. I unbolted the door, knowing that whatever he came to say would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the battle I was waging. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, keeping the chain engaged until I saw my father standing alone under the harsh corridor light. Thomas White had not visited my home in the 5 years I had lived there. He stood shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his shoulders slumped under a cheap, faded windbreaker that he had owned since I was a teenager. The scent of diesel fuel, stale coffee, and old regrets hung around him like a heavy fog. He did not try to push his way inside. Instead, he stared at his worn leather boots and asked if we could go somewhere neutral to talk. I hesitated. The throbbing pain in my ribs, a harsh reminder of why I should shut the door in his face. But a small, lingering fragment of a daughter's hope compelled me to unlatch the chain. I told him I would not invite him into my sanctuary, but I would meet him at the 24-hour diner down on the Mobile waterfront. We took separate cars. I drove down Government Street toward the river, the humid night air pressing against my windshield. The smear campaign had pushed my endurance to the brink, isolating me from my peers and threatening my corporate career. Now, my father's sudden appearance felt like an attempt to push me over the edge. I parked near the water, where the cargo ships loomed like iron mountains against the dark sky, waiting to cross into the Gulf of Mexico. The diner was nearly empty, lit by flickering neon signs and smelling of fried grease and chicory coffee. We took a booth in the back corner. The vinyl seats were cracked, and the table was sticky with a residue that refused to wash away. It was a fitting location for the conversation we were about to endure. My father did not order food. He wrapped his calloused hands around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee and stared into the dark liquid as if searching for a script. "Grace, please drop this," he pleaded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Your mother is terrified. She is not sleeping. She paces the house all night long." The sheer audacity of his opening statement struck me like a physical blow. He had not asked about my health. He had not asked how I was managing to survive after losing my freelance clients to his wife's vicious rumors. His only concern was the insomnia of the woman who had orchestrated my ruin. The resentment bubbled up in my throat, hot and acidic. I leaned forward across the sticky table, ignoring the sharp protest of my bruised ribs, and cut straight to the core of the issue. "Did you know she forged my signature on Granddad's trust documents?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm. I watched him flinch. The diner felt heavy with the weight of the unspoken truth. He hesitated. It was a long, agonizing pause where I watched the man who used to carry me on his shoulders debate whether to lie to my face. He looked out the window at the dark water of the bay, unable to sustain a gaze with his own child. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I knew. The confession hung in the air, a toxic revelation that poisoned every memory I had of him. He began to explain, his words rushing out in a pathetic, desperate stream. He confessed that he had let Evelyn run their finances with an iron fist ever since he nearly bankrupted the family with a failed commercial shrimping venture back in '98. I remembered that year. I remembered the arguments echoing through the walls, the sudden disappearance of his beloved trawler, and the way my father shrank into a shadow of his former self. "She saved us from losing the house back then," Thomas mumbled, his hands shaking around the coffee mug. "I was drowning in debt from the boat. And she took over everything. She kept a roof over our heads." Grace. I owed her my silence. I sat back against the cracked vinyl seat, processing the staggering magnitude of his cowardice. He had witnessed his wife commit felony fraud against his eldest daughter, stealing my inheritance to fund country club dues and Savannah's pageant dresses, and he had justified it as a form of marital debt. He had sacrificed my future to pay off his own guilt. "You didn't owe her my life." "Dad," I replied, my voice dangerous and steady. "You owed her an apology for a bad business deal. You did not owe her the right to steal $1 million from your child." The neat, logical part of my accountant brain was disgusted by his math. He had traded my financial independence for his own domestic peace. He reached across the table, his rough fingers grasping my forearm. "Grace, you have to remember family loyalty," he begged, his eyes wide and frantic. "We are all we have. If this goes to court, it will destroy her. The community will tear us apart. Please, just sign the settlement," she offered. "We can find a way to make it right over time." The physical contact repulsed me. I yanked my arm away, the sudden movement causing a spike of agony in my chest. The messy, unfiltered reality of my emotions broke through my carefully maintained professional exterior. I was not just angry, I was profoundly repulsed by the weakness sitting across from me. His complicity was a far deeper betrayal than her theft. Evelyn was driven by a deep-seated, irrational terror of poverty, a neurotic need to hoard resources. But Thomas was driven by pure cowardice. He knew exactly what her actions cost me. He understood the criminality of it, and he chose to look away because intervening would have required him to stand up to his wife. Have you ever realized that the parent you viewed as a passive victim was actually a willing accomplice to your suffering? Tell me how you handled that betrayal in the comments. I looked at the man who had taught me how to cast a fishing line in the Mobile Delta, and I realized I did not know him at all. He was an empty vessel, a man who had traded his integrity for a quiet life. I slid out of the booth, tossing a $5 bill onto the table to cover the coffee. I'm not signing anything, I told him, standing tall despite the stabbing pain in my side. And I am not dropping the lawsuit. You and Evelyn are going to have to face the ledger you created. Thomas stood up, panic etching deep lines into his weathered face. He reached into the inside pocket of his windbreaker and pulled out a crumpled, heavy manila envelope. Grace, wait, he urged, shoving the envelope toward me. She does not know I took this. She is preparing for the legal fight. But she is losing her grip. She drafted this sworn affidavit yesterday with her attorney. She is going to submit it to the court on Monday to force a formal proceeding. She thinks she can outsmart your lawyer. She thinks she can testify her way out of this. I took the envelope, the paper feeling rough against my fingertips. Thomas looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, desperately hoping the wind would change direction. She is volunteering to sit for a deposition, he revealed, his voice trembling. She believes she can convince them that you authorized the trust extension verbally, and she has lined up members of her mystic society to serve as character witnesses against your mental state. I stared at the envelope, a sharp, electric thrill cutting through my exhaustion. Evelyn was so intoxicated by her own social manipulation that she was voluntarily stepping into a sworn legal setting. She assumed she could charm a room full of attorneys the same way she charmed a church committee. She had no idea that Mr. Vance and I had already secured a 40-page forensic document examiner's report, proving her forgery down to the microscopic hesitations in the ink. She was walking willingly into a perjury trap under oath. You should not have shown me this, Dad, I said, tapping the envelope against the edge of the table. You just handed me the exact itinerary of her downfall. Thomas stared at me, his expression caught between sorrow and terror. He had brought the affidavit, hoping to show me how serious Evelyn was, hoping the threat of her sworn testimony would intimidate me into dropping the case. He fundamentally misunderstood the daughter he was dealing with. He thought I was still the girl who would shrink away from a public conflict to maintain the peace. He did not realize he had just provided me with the golden ticket to shatter her defense. I walked out of the diner, leaving him standing alone in the harsh neon light. The humid air rolling off the bay felt crisp and invigorating in my lungs. My father's attempt to shield his wife had inadvertently sealed her fate. I drove back to my condo with a renewed, predatory focus. I needed to call Mr. Vance. The moment the sun came up, we had to ensure that Evelyn's request for a deposition was granted immediately, before she realized the depth of the evidence we possessed. The war of attrition and social smears was about to end. The battlefield was shifting from the grocery store aisles to a sterile conference room with a court reporter, where neighborhood gossip holds no weight against scientific proof. The deposition was set, and I was going to watch her meticulously constructed illusion collapse under the weight of her own sworn lies. 7 months had passed since the twisted metal of my car pinned me on the interstate. My ribs no longer required a rigid brace, though a dull ache flared whenever the coastal humidity spiked. The legal pressure cooker we had meticulously built was finally reaching its boiling point. The setting for this reckoning was a sterile, windowless conference room in Mr. Vance's downtown law firm. A heavy mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by stiff leather chairs that offered no comfort. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers resting lightly on the stenotype keys, ready to carve every spoken word into the permanent legal record. I sat next to Mr. Vance, wearing a tailored navy suit that projected the exact corporate competence my mother had spent months telling Mobile society I lacked. My hands rested flat on the table, Steady and cool. The heavy oak door opened, and Evelyn walked in. She had dressed for an audience. She wore a tailored beige linen dress, her signature strand of pearls resting against her collarbone, and her hair perfectly styled to project an image of wounded dignity. She looked like a woman preparing to chair a charity luncheon, not a defendant arriving for a sworn deposition regarding fraud. Her attorney, a flustered man who looked like he had already spent too many billable hours managing her ego, trailed behind her. Evelyn did not look at me. She pulled her chair out, smoothed her skirt, and offered the court reporter a polite, practiced nod. She was banking on her southern charm, certain she could navigate this legal hurdle the same way she handled a difficult country club committee meeting. Mr. Vance began with surgical precision. He did not raise his voice. He asked basic, foundational questions, establishing her identity, her role as the trustee of my grandfather's estate, and her understanding of the penalties for perjury. Evelyn answered with a soft, melodic tone, playing the part of a cooperative, heartbroken mother. Then Mr. Vance pivoted to the $4,300 monthly transfers I had made to the joint account for 10 years. He asked her to define the nature of those payments. Evelyn straightened her spine, looking directly at the camera, recording the session. She testified, under oath, that those transfers were voluntary gifts. She claimed I had offered the money out of a sense of familial duty to support my younger sister, Savannah, through her various life transitions. She smiled a sad, maternal smile, stating that I had always been so eager to help the family until my tragic accident clouded my judgment. Mr. Vance let her finish. He let her commit to the lie on the official record. Then, he reached into his briefcase and retrieved a thick, bound document. It was the 40-page report from the Independent Forensic Document Examiner. He slid a copy across the mahogany table toward Evelyn and her attorney. He asked her to identify the document attached as Exhibit A. It was the addendum to my grandfather's trust, the one deferring my inheritance to age 40. Evelyn glanced at it, her chin held high, and confirmed it was the amendment I had supposedly signed 4 years ago. Mr. Vance read the examiner's conclusion aloud. The report detailed the microscopic hesitations in the ink flow, the unnatural pressure points, and the incorrect looping of the letter W. The expert definitively concluded that the signature was a trace forgery executed by Evelyn herself. The transformation was instantaneous. The blood drained from Evelyn's face, leaving her skin a chalky, pale gray. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tight her knuckles turned white. The poised, gracious matriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. Her attorney frantically flipped through the report, his face mirroring her panic. He leaned over, whispering urgently in her ear, likely advising her to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights. But Evelyn had spent her entire life believing she was the smartest person in the room. She ignored her counsel. She leaned toward the microphone and began to argue with the forensic science, claiming the expert was mistaken, that I had signed it in front of her during a holiday dinner. Mr. Vance did not argue. He simply produced the next piece of evidence. He laid out the subpoenaed bank records, heavy stacks of paper detailing the exact routing of the trust yields over the past decade. He traced the money line by line. The trust was legally mandated to hold and grow the principal for my benefit. Instead, the records showed Evelyn directly transferring tens of thousands of dollars from the trust account into a secondary checking account. From there, the funds flowed directly to vendors for Savannah's wedding fund, to high-end bridal boutiques, and to catering companies. Mr. Vance asked her to explain why fiduciary funds meant for my future were paying for floral arrangements at a country club. Evelyn panicked. The undeniable paper trail shattered her composure. She started talking rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate, tangled mess. She contradicted her own previous statements within minutes. She claimed the wedding expenses were loans, then immediately pivoted to saying the trust allowed for family emergency disbursements. When Mr. Vance pointed out that a luxury wedding is not a legal emergency, her facade crumbled entirely. She raised her voice, her southern drawl turning sharp and shrill. She shouted that she was just protecting the money. She claimed I was irresponsible, that my career as a tax accountant was unstable, and that I would have squandered my grandfather's legacy if she had not intervened to safeguard it for the family's true needs. The court reporter's fingers flew across the stenotype keys with rhythmic, merciless efficiency. Every stutter, every fabricated excuse, and every admission of guilt was carved into the official record. Evelyn was testifying to her own breach of fiduciary duty, admitting on tape that she had misappropriated trust funds because she personally disagreed with my financial competence. Her lawyer put his face in his hands, knowing his client had just handed the opposition a rapt and bowed victory. I sat across the table, my posture rigid, watching the woman who had abandoned me in a hospital trauma unit finally face the cold, unyielding architecture of her own fraud. She had nowhere left to hide. The rumors she had spread in Spring Hill, the whispers at the grocery store, none of it mattered in this room. The only thing that mattered was the ledger. And the ledger proved she was a thief. The deposition concluded shortly after her outburst, her lawyer hastily calling for a recess to stop the bleeding. Evelyn grabbed her designer purse and fled the room, refusing to look in my direction. Mr. Vance closed his files, offering me a rare, satisfied nod. The forgery and the theft were now undeniable matters of public record. We had the leverage to strip her of the trusteeship and demand full restitution. But the satisfaction of the moment was interrupted by the sudden opening of the conference room door. A legal courier stepped inside, handing Mr. Vance a sealed manila envelope marked for immediate delivery. My attorney tore it open, his eyes scanning the cover page. The document pertained to the injunction Savannah and Tucker had filed against me over the fabricated house down payment. As part of our aggressive discovery process, Mr. Vance had subpoenaed Tucker's business financials to verify his claim of allocated funds and operational damages. Mr. Vance looked up, a sharp gleam in his eye. He slid the document toward me. Tucker's Gulf Shores real estate development firm did not exist in any functional capacity. The financial records revealed it was a hollow shell company drowning in massive commercial debt. Tucker had been using the fake lawsuit against me to delay his own impending bankruptcy filings, hoping to extract a quick settlement to appease his angry creditors. Savannah was not just suing me out of spite. She had tied her future to a man who was orchestrating a desperate financial fraud of his own, and the impending fallout was about to drag her down into a very real, very public disaster. 2 weeks dragged by, filled with the relentless grind of tax season and the throbbing ache in my healing ribs. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived with heavy rain washing the mobile streets. I walked into the county courthouse alongside Mr. Vance. The building smelled of old paper and ammonia. Tucker sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a crisp seersucker suit, projecting the easy confidence of a man who believed the legal system existed to serve his whims. Savannah sat behind him in the gallery. She wore a tailored linen dress, her posture rigid, anticipating a swift settlement check to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Tucker was a familiar archetype in this city. He was a former fraternity president who built a real estate portfolio on charm, wealthy acquaintances, and highly leveraged loans. He assumed my role as a corporate tax accountant meant I was quietly hoarding a fortune. He also assumed I would buckle under the threat of litigation to avoid a public scandal. He smirked as we took our seats, leaning back in his chair and whispering a joke to his discount attorney. He expected me to offer a settlement right there to make the problem go away. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for wasted docket time, called the session to order. Tucker's attorney stood up and presented their case for the injunction, repeating the fabricated claim about my verbal promise to fund a $60,000 down payment for a Gulf Shores property. He argued that Tucker's firm had suffered severe operational damages because I reneged on the deal. It was a neat, tidy narrative of a wealthy, spiteful sister ruining a young couple's dream. Mr. Vance did not object during the opening statement. He waited until it was his turn to address the bench. He stood, unbuttoning his suit jacket, and approached the judge with a thick stack of manila folders. These were the documents obtained during the aggressive discovery phase. The financial records subpoenaed directly from Tucker's corporate accounts. Mr. Vance requested permission to enter the ledgers into evidence, explaining they directly contradicted the plaintiff's claim of operational damages. The judge reviewed the top sheet. Tucker's attorney demanded to see the discovery file. As the opposing counsel flipped through the pages, the smug confidence vanished from his face. The documents revealed a staggering level of insolvency. Tucker's much-boasted Gulf Coast real estate empire was a phantom structure. His corporate lines of credit were exhausted. Multiple liens had been filed against his active properties by unpaid contractors. His business checking account was overdrawn, and he was facing an imminent foreclosure on his primary investment site. Mr. Vance laid out the timeline with brutal efficiency. The $60,000 Tucker claimed I had promised for a domestic down payment was the exact sum required to hold off his primary commercial creditors for another quarter. He did not want to buy a house with my sister. He was drowning in toxic debt and desperately needed a rapid infusion of cash to prevent his entire house of cards from collapsing. He had manipulated a spoiled naive woman into suing her own family, treating me like a personal bailout fund. Savannah was sitting close enough to hear every word of the financial summary. Mr. Vance requested that the plaintiff confirm the balance sheets. Tucker stammered, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He tried to argue that the business debts were separate from the personal housing contract, but the commingling of funds was documented in his own bank transfers. The illusion he had sold to Savannah was unraveling in real time, documented in black ink and red deficits. The judge called a brief recess to review the motion to dismiss, sending us all out into the corridor. The polished marble hallway became the stage for a spectacular reckoning. Savannah did not possess the emotional regulation to keep her composure in a public setting. She had spent her life shielded from hardship, funded by my stolen labor, and coddled by our mother. Now, she was staring at the undeniable proof that her chosen partner was a parasite. The confrontation was not a clean, cinematic breakup. It was a chaotic, guttural display of profound humiliation. Savannah shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings, drawing the attention of passing clerks and bailiffs. She demanded to know if the ledgers were real. Tucker tried to shush her, grabbing her arm and begging her to keep her voice down. He muttered excuses about cash flow problems and temporary setbacks. But his frantic tone only confirmed the truth. "You used me," Savannah sobbed, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "You do not even have the money for a wedding. You just thought I was your ticket to a payout?" She realized, in that glaring hallway light, that she was not cherished. She was a mark. Tucker had pursued her solely because he believed the myth of the white family wealth, a myth sustained by my quiet, involuntary subsidies. Savannah wrenched her arm out of his grasp. She reached for her left hand, twisting the 2-carat engagement ring off her finger. She threw the jewelry directly at his chest. The ring bounced off his pastel lapel and hit the linoleum floor with a sharp ping, rolling away toward the elevator banks. Tucker did not try to comfort her. He dropped to his hands and knees, scrambling across the dirty floor in his expensive suit, desperately searching for the diamond. It was a pathetic, wretched sight. I stood near the courtroom doors, watching the sister who had treated me as a disposable resource finally encounter a consequence she could not charm her way out of. For the first time in her life, she had to pay the price for her own terrible judgment. I did not feel pity, nor did I feel an urge to comfort her. I simply watched the inevitable result of a life built on unearned privilege. Savannah turned and ran toward the stairwell, her heels echoing a frantic retreat. We returned to the courtroom. Tucker sat alone at the plaintiff's table, the recovered ring stuffed into his pocket, his attorney looking eager to conclude the disastrous session. The judge did not mince words. She admonished Tucker for utilizing the court system to execute a frivolous extortion attempt. She dismissed the temporary injunction with prejudice, ensuring he could never refile the claim. She also ordered the plaintiff to cover all of my associated attorney fees for the baseless litigation. The strike of the gavel echoed through the wood-paneled room. It was the sound of my financial oxygen returning. Within an hour, the freeze order was lifted. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and watched my banking app refresh. The funds in my primary checking account became accessible. I could pay my medical copays. I could buy groceries without calculating the exact cost of a generic box of pasta. The first heavy chain binding my life had snapped. Tucker was neutralized, sent back to deal with the ruins of his bankrupt enterprise. Savannah was shattered, her social climbing halted by the harsh reality of her own gullibility. The peripheral threats were gone, leaving only the core architect of the deception. Evelyn was now entirely isolated. Her golden child was ruined. Her husband was a confessed coward, and her stolen funds were cut off. She knew Mr. Vance was finalizing the packet of forgery evidence to submit to the district attorney. The threat of a felony indictment was no longer a vague possibility. It was an impending certainty, driven into a corner with no remaining allies. Evelyn bypassed the legal channels. She decided to bring the ward directly to the one place I still had left to lose. The following morning, I received an urgent page to report to the executive suite at my logistics firm. My mother had decided to play her final desperate hand. The summons to the executive suite arrived just before my lunch hour. The message from the front desk was brief, stating only that I had an urgent personal visitor who refused to leave the lobby. My initial thought was that Savannah had returned for another public tantrum, perhaps seeking a new scapegoat now that her real estate fiancé had been exposed as a bankrupt fraud. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer, ignoring the faint, lingering throb in my ribs, and walked down the long, carpeted corridor of the logistics firm. The corporate environment was a sanctuary of order and predictable routines, a stark contrast to the chaotic wreckage of my family. I turned the corner into the glass-walled reception area and stopped in my tracks. It was not my sister waiting by the elevators. It was my mother. Evelyn looked as though she had aged 10 years since the deposition. The impeccable grooming that defined her entire existence had vanished. Her tailored linen suit hung loosely on her frame, wrinkled and devoid of its usual crisp elegance. The heavy layer of foundation and powder could not hide the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, nor could it conceal the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her posture. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. She knew Mr. Vance had finished compiling the final evidentiary packet. She knew the independent forensic report, the subpoenaed banking ledgers, and the transcript of her own disastrous sworn testimony were sitting on his desk. She understood that my attorney was preparing to hand the entire portfolio over to the Mobile County District Attorney before the close of business today. The outcome of that referral would be a formal indictment for felony document forgery and breach of fiduciary duty, charges that carried guaranteed prison time. I instructed the receptionist to hold my calls and guided Evelyn into an empty, soundproof conference room near the back of the suite. The door clicked shut, severing us from the polite hum of the corporate office. Evelyn did not wait for me to sit down. She collapsed into one of the ergonomic leather chairs and began to weep. These were not the calculated, theatrical tears she deployed at church committee meetings or society luncheons to garner sympathy. This was the raw, hyperventilating panic of a cornered predator. She begged for mercy, her voice cracking as she pleaded with me not to send my own mother to a concrete cell. She brought up my childhood. She invoked the memory of my grandfather, and she desperately tried to weave a narrative where her theft was just a misguided attempt to keep our family unified. I stood on the opposite side of the long mahogany table and watched her unravel. I expected to feel a surge of vindication. I had spent 15 years serving as the unappreciated infrastructure of her life, subsidizing her comfort while she mocked my career and drained my inheritance. I had survived a car crash, a financial freeze, a smear campaign, and a frivolous lawsuit just to reach this exact vantage point. Yet, looking at the weeping, hollowed-out woman clutching a damp tissue, I did not feel triumphant. I felt profoundly tired. The anger that had fueled my survival over the past 7 months had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, sterile clarity. She was not a mastermind to be vanquished. She was simply a coward, terrified of facing the ledger she had written. I opened my briefcase and retrieved a thick, bound legal folder. I slid the settlement agreement across the smooth surface of the desk until it came to rest directly in front of her trembling hands. The terms Mr. Vance and I had drafted were absolute, designed to dismantle her power structure permanently. The first stipulation required her immediate, legally binding resignation as the managing trustee of my grandfather's estate. The second stipulation was the financial reckoning. She was mandated to repay the $300,000 she had stolen from the trust principal over the past decade. Given her lack of liquid capital, the agreement explicitly required the swift liquidation of her personal assets to satisfy the debt. I looked down at her and delivered the ultimatum without raising my voice. Sign it, or I call the district attorney right now. Mr. Vance has a courier waiting in his lobby for my signal. Evelyn stared at the pages, her breath catching in her throat. She read the asset liquidation clause and balked, the last remnants of her southern pride flaring up in a futile protest. She begged me to find another way, to allow her to establish a payment plan that would not require selling her home. She claimed a forced property sale in the middle of the Spring Hill social season would prompt unavoidable questions from her neighbors and ruin their standing in the community. She argued that losing the house would destroy the only respectable thing the White family had left. Your standing was built on stolen money. Mom, I told her, my tone devoid of any sympathy. You financed your reputation with my future. Sign the paper. She looked into my eyes, searching for a trace of the compliant, desperate daughter who used to wire thousands of dollars on the first of every month just to earn a crumb of affection. She found nothing but the unyielding gaze of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent return. The reality of her situation settled over her. Her hands shook with uncontrollable tremors as she reached for the silver pen resting on the table. She hovered over the signature line for a long, agonizing moment, the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders. Then, she pressed the pen to the paper. She signed her name, the sharp strokes of her cursive legally ending her reign of financial terror over my life. She pushed the document back across the table, exhaling a long, shuddering breath, believing she had just negotiated her way out of total annihilation. Thank you, Grace, she whispered, wiping a streak of ruined mascara from her cheek. I swear to you, I will make this right. I will list the house tomorrow. You will not regret giving me this grace. I will never bother you again. I picked up the settlement agreement, checking the notary seals and verifying her signature to ensure every line was legally binding. I slipped the document back into my briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet conference room. I looked at the woman who had abandoned me in a trauma ward, and I decided it was time to deliver the final piece of the arithmetic. You are shielded from the state forgery charges, I said, leaning against the edge of the conference table. Mr. Vance will hold the criminal complaint, and you will not go to a local prison for breaching the trust. You bought your freedom from the Mobile County District Attorney today. Evelyn closed her eyes in relief, her shoulders dropping an inch. However, I continued, my voice steady and precise. As a licensed corporate tax accountant, I operate under a strict code of professional ethics and federal reporting mandates. During my forensic review of the trust ledgers, I documented $300,000 in embezzled capital that you routed into your personal accounts to fund Savannah's lifestyle and your own expenses over the past 10 years. Evelyn opened her eyes. A new, unfamiliar confusion replacing her initial relief. According to the federal tax code, embezzled funds are classified as taxable income. I explained, watching the dawning horror stretch across her features. You did not declare a single cent of that $300,000 on your joint federal tax returns. While you avoided a state forgery conviction today, you have committed severe, protracted tax evasion. To protect my own certified public accountant license from complicity, I was legally obligated to report discovered financial crimes of this magnitude. She stopped breathing. The implications hit her like a freight train. I submitted the finalized forensic accounting report to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division yesterday morning. I revealed, letting the truth dismantle the last of her defenses. The federal government does not care about your social standing in Spring Hill. Mom, they do not care about neighborhood gossip or Mystic Society galas. They only care about the unpaid taxes, the compounding penalties, and the decade of federal fraud. I dropped the local criminal complaint to recover my inheritance, but the federal audit is entirely out of my hands. Evelyn sat paralyzed in the leather chair, the realization crushing the breath out of her lungs. She had signed away her home, her trust control, and her local reputation to avoid a state prison cell, only to learn that her own daughter had meticulously calculated a federal trap she could never charm her way out of. The United States government was coming for her ledger, and unlike me, they would not offer a settlement agreement. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on her silent, devastating ruin, and walked out of the conference room, leaving her alone to calculate the true cost of her greed. The consequences played out in broad daylight under the unforgiving Alabama sun. Evelyn had built her entire identity around the prestige of her Spring Hill address. It was a fortress constructed from pilfered trust yields and my own monthly subsidies to meet the strict terms of the civil restitution agreement. My parents were forced to list the colonial home on the open market. They could not hide the urgency of the transaction. The real estate sign went into the manicured front lawn right as the mobile Mardi Gras season reached its peak. It is a time of year when the city is consumed by heritage and social rank, where elite mystic societies hold their exclusive masquerade balls. Evelyn had spent decades climbing that specific ladder. Now, her former peers watched from their wrought iron balconies as the moving trucks arrived. The dismantlement of their estate was a public spectacle. The movers hauled away the imported patio furniture, the heavy antique sideboards, and the custom French doors that Evelyn had purchased using the money intended for my future. I did not drive by to watch the physical removal of their belongings. I preferred to review the process through the sterile lens of legal documentation provided by Mr. Vance. My parents downsized to a cramped, two-bedroom rental apartment in a rougher zip code near the industrial shipyards. The local elite operate by a ruthless set of rules. Financial ruin is considered a tragic misfortune. But stealing from your own injured child to fund country club dues is an unforgivable scandal. The women who used to invite Evelyn to charity luncheons severed all ties. Her phone stopped ringing. The social isolation she had tried to inflict upon me rebounded onto her, suffocating her last remaining shreds of dignity. Savannah encountered a brutal awakening of her own. Her real estate developer fiancé dropped her the moment the injunction failed, and my financial pipeline ran dry. Tucker recognized that the mythical family fortune was inaccessible, so he cut his losses and vanished to handle his own impending bankruptcy. Savannah had spent her entire adult life treating pageant titles and boutique shopping as a substitute for a career. Without my $4,300 monthly wire transfer, she could not afford the premium lease on her luxury SUV or her downtown apartment. Her credit cards were declined across the city. She faced the terrifying prospect of earning her own survival. My younger sister was forced to abandon her superficial lifestyle and seek immediate employment. She secured a position as a receptionist at a high-volume dental clinic just off the interstate. A former high school classmate of ours happened to use that specific clinic and gleefully relayed the details to the local gossip network. Savannah now spent 40 hours a week wearing generic blue scrubs, answering phones, and scheduling root canals just to keep her vehicle from being repossessed by the bank. I felt no urge to gloat over her predicament. I viewed the $516,000 I had lost over the past decade as the steep tuition required to learn a hard, permanent lesson about the true cost of familial obligation. The legal machinery finalized the asset transfers 2 weeks after the house sale closed. Mr. Vance deposited the recovered $300,000 of stolen principal into a secure escrow account. Shortly thereafter, the primary components of my grandfather's legacy were legally unbound from Evelyn's control. The $1.2 million from the original trust was wired into a private wealth management account solely under my name. I sat in my corporate office and stared at the digital ledger on my monitor. The numbers represented my grandfather's lifetime of labor, finally resting in the hands he had intended. I secured the funds behind a fortress of diversified bonds and ironclad legal protections managed by an independent fiduciary firm. The infrastructure of their entitlement had been thoroughly demolished. Yet the cessation of their comfort did not mark the end of the hostilities. The settlement agreement only protected Evelyn from the state forgery charges. The federal government operated on a different schedule. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had processed the forensic accounting report I submitted. The agents did not announce their arrival with polite phone calls. They showed up unannounced at the cramped rental apartment near the shipyards on a Tuesday morning. The federal investigators presented warrants to seize my parents' remaining financial records, targeting the undeclared income Evelyn had embezzled over the years. The sudden arrival of federal agents triggered a frantic, chaotic reaction within the remains of the White family. Evelyn realized that the civil restitution she had paid to me did not erase the profound tax liabilities and compounding fraud penalties she now owed the federal government. The IRS placed an immediate freeze on her and Thomas's meager checking accounts. Desperate and out of options, Evelyn attempted to pull Savannah into her defense strategy. She called my sister, demanding that Savannah sign a backdated affidavit claiming the embezzled trust funds were educational loans rather than undeclared income. Evelyn needed a scapegoat, and she expected her favored child to provide the necessary cover. This demand introduced a fatal fracture into their remaining alliance. Savannah had spent her life taking whatever Evelyn offered, never questioning the source of the wealth. But working at the dental clinic had introduced Savannah to the harsh realities of the working class. She had spent a month dealing with angry patients, strict supervisors, and the crushing weight of utility bills. When her mother demanded she commit perjury to defraud the federal government, Savannah finally recognized the true nature of their relationship. Evelyn was willing to risk her youngest daughter's freedom to save her own skin. Savannah refused to sign the fabricated affidavit. The conflict escalated into a screaming match in the parking lot of the dental clinic, witnessed by several dental hygienists on their lunch break. Evelyn slapped Savannah across the face, calling her an ungrateful burden. Savannah drove away, leaving Evelyn standing alone on the hot asphalt. But Savannah did not just walk away from the argument. She inherited a survival instinct born from self-preservation. She realized that the IRS would eventually trace the embezzled trust yields directly into her personal checking accounts. If the federal agents determined she was a willing participant in the tax evasion scheme, she could face criminal charges for receiving stolen property. My phone buzzed late on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing a corporate merger file at my kitchen island. The caller ID displayed Savannah's name. It was the first time she had initiated contact since the disaster in my condo lobby. I considered ignoring the call, but a sharp curiosity compelled me to answer. Savannah did not scream or demand money. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by the sheer terror of federal prosecution. She asked for the contact information of the lead IRS investigator assigned to Evelyn's case. I asked her why she needed that specific phone number. Savannah took a shaky breath and delivered a revelation that rewrote the entire power dynamic of our family history. She told me she had kept a hidden lockbox containing physical copies of every bank transfer, gift receipt, and luxury purchase order Evelyn had ever routed to her. Savannah had hoarded the records not out of diligence, but out of a paranoid fear that Tucker might try to steal her assets during their engagement. Now, those meticulous records constituted an irrefutable map of Evelyn's tax fraud. Savannah informed me she was driving to the federal building the next morning. She had scheduled a meeting with the agents to hand over the lockbox and turn state's evidence against our mother in exchange for full legal immunity. The favored daughter was about to deliver the final, crushing blow. A full year has passed since the crumpled metal of my sedan trapped me on the interstate. The calendar flipped to August, bringing the stifling Alabama heat that makes the air feel thick enough to swim through. I sat on the modest front steps of Mawmaw Loretta's house, watching the fireflies blink against the fading dusk. The heavy scent of blooming jasmine drifted across the yard, masking the distant smell of the coastal tide. We were eating slices of homemade pecan pie off flimsy paper plates, the sugary syrup sticking to our fingers. I took a deep, deliberate breath, expanding my chest fully just to relish the sensation. My ribs had healed. The sharp, stabbing pain that once dictated every physical movement had faded into a faint memory, much like the people who originally caused it. The fallout from Savannah handing over her hidden lockbox to the government investigators had been swift and merciless. Evelyn could not charm her way past a Department of Justice tax audit. The paper trail Savannah provided was an airtight map of systematic tax evasion, facing decades in a federal facility. My mother accepted a plea agreement, trading her Spring Hill prestige for a 3-year sentence in a minimum security correctional institution in Florida. Thomas, stripped of his wife's iron grip and the stolen funds, relocated to a dilapidated trailer park on the outskirts of the county. He had not attempted to contact me since our brief meeting at the diner. I never received an apology, and sitting on the porch, I finally accepted that I never would. You cannot extract genuine remorse from individuals who view you merely as a utility. Their silence was not a punishment. It was a confirmation that my usefulness to them had permanently expired. My professional life experienced a remarkable resurrection. The details of the trust embezzlement and the federal indictment became a matter of public record, splashed across the local business journals. The rumor of my fabricated brain injury dissolved instantly. The community realized I was not a mentally unstable daughter, but a highly competent auditor who had systematically dismantled a sophisticated financial crime. The owner of the Heritage Bakery, the man who had dropped my services out of concern for my stability, showed up at my corporate firm carrying a box of assorted pastries. He stood in my lobby, shifting nervously, and asked to reinstate our contract. He offered a halting explanation about trusting the wrong sources. For a fraction of a second, the urge to throw the pastry box against the glass wall surged through my veins. It was a messy, bitter spike of lingering resentment. I took a breath, accepted the box, and told him my roster was currently full. I handed the baked goods to the receptionist and walked away. I declined to take back any client who had believed the whispers over my proven track record. My corporate firm promoted me to a senior advisory role, recognizing the precise, lethal efficiency I had demonstrated in my personal legal battle. The financial architecture of my life was finally secure. The $1.2 million from my grandfather's trust resided in a private wealth management account, heavily guarded by an independent fiduciary team. I watched the $516,000 I had lost over the previous decade fade into the ledger as a steep, unavoidable tuition fee for learning how to set boundaries. I did not mourn the lost funds. I considered the money a ransom paid for my permanent freedom. Savannah had avoided criminal prosecution through her immunity deal. But the revenue agents had seized every luxury item purchased with the stolen yields. She was currently taking the city bus to her receptionist job at the dental clinic, living in a studio apartment she could barely afford. The favored child had crashed into the reality of the working class, stripped of her safety net. Loretta set her paper plate on the wooden railing and asked if I regretted how harsh the landing had been for them. I looked at my grandmother, her face lined with decades of quiet endurance, and shook my head. "The truth does not care about comfort," I replied, picking up my iced tea. "I did not build the trap. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see it." We sat in companionable silence, listening to the rhythmic chirp of the crickets. I realized then that the most valuable asset I gained from the wreckage was not the trust fund or the corporate promotion. The true prize was the unyielding boundary I had constructed around my existence. The people who loved me for who I am were sitting on these steps. The ones who only loved what I could provide were gone, locked away by their own greed. But a tax professional knows that every ledger requires a final reconciliation. The story of my family's ruin seemed complete, yet the federal government operates on a distinct set of mathematical principles. Yesterday afternoon, I received a certified letter from the Department of the Treasury. I had brought the heavy envelope with me to the house, waiting for the right moment to open it. I pulled the parchment from my purse and broke the seal. The letter detailed the conclusion of Evelyn's tax evasion case. The Revenue Service had successfully recovered the unpaid taxes, the compounding interest, and the severe fraud penalties assessed against my mother's hidden assets. The second page of the document contained the twist that Evelyn could never have anticipated. When I submitted the 40-page forensic accounting report to the Criminal Investigation Division, I did not just file an anonymous tip. As a licensed financial professional, I filed Form 211. I registered as an official government whistleblower. The federal program dictates that an individual who provides actionable, documented evidence of significant tax fraud is entitled to a mandatory percentage of the collected proceeds. The agency does not view this as a reward. They view it as an auditor's commission. I unfolded the attached Treasury check. The United States government had calculated my whistleblower percentage based on the severity of the fraud and the precise documentation I provided. The sum printed on the check was $498,000. The federal government had essentially reimbursed me for the decade of financial abuse I had suffered. I had audited my own abusers, exposed their crimes, and the Department of the Treasury paid me a bounty that nearly matched every single cent I had wired to that joint account. I handed the check to Loretta. She adjusted her reading glasses, stared at the numbers, and let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed into the humid night. I had survived the physical wreck on the interstate. And more importantly, I had survived the emotional wreckage of my lineage. The debt was settled. The books were officially closed. And the final balance was in my favor. I stood up from the porch chair, looking out over the dark, quiet neighborhood. The air felt lighter. I was no longer the silent load-bearing wall for a decaying family. I was the architect of my own life. If you have ever had to close the ledger on toxic relatives to save yourself, drop a comment below and share how you found your freedom. Do not forget to subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories for more accounts of those who refuse to be broken. I am Grace White, and I am finally, truly free.